The afternoon sky was a smooth, pale grey without any clouds, just a single, even tone from horizon to horizon. You stood at the edge of a wide field that lay between your camp and the distant walled city, a city whose pale stone walls rose silently beyond a stretch of farmland and fallow grass. Nothing moved along those walls, no banners, no figures, just the long horizontal line of parapets and the darker shapes of gates set into the stone. The air was mild and carried the faint scent of dry earth and something green crushed underfoot. You shifted the strap of your satchel on your shoulder and took a first step into the field. The grass was not tall, coming only a little past your ankle, a mixture of pale green and sun-bleached yellow blades that bent easily under the weight of your boots. You walked slowly, your pace unhurried, letting your eyes drift across the ground to read the lay of the land. The field sloped gently downward from the tree line behind you toward a shallow depression about 200 paces ahead, then rose again in a soft swell before flattening out near the distant walls. There was a particular quality to the quiet here, a silence made of small sounds, the whisper of grass against itself, the distant coo of a wood pigeon from the forest edge, your own steady footfalls pressing the stems into the soil. You paused after walking 30 paces and stood still, letting the field settle around you. The city walls were far enough that you could not make out individual stones. Just a pale ribbon stretched across the horizon, like a chalk line drawn on grey paper. Between you and those walls lay enough distance to provide safety for the work ahead, enough room to gather materials and assemble a large machine without any sense of urgency. The distance also offered a kind of peace, knowing that the task did not need to be completed quickly, that the days would unfold one by one in a long chain of calm hours. You turned your head slowly to survey the ground more carefully. There were no large rocks visible in the grass, no sudden dips or marshy patches, only the gentle undulations of land that had been grazed by sheep some months ago and since left to rest. The soil beneath the grass revealed itself where a badger had dug a small scraping. It was brown and loamy, with a scattering of small white flints. You knelt down and pushed aside the grass to touch the earth, pressing your palm flat against it, feeling the coolness and the slight moisture from the morning dew still lingering deep in the roots. The ground was firm but not hard, capable of holding heavy timbers without shifting too much. Rising again, you brushed your hand on your tunic and turned back to look at the tree line from which you had come. There, a rough track led into the woods, wide enough for a cart, its ruts packed down by the wheels of supply wagons that had been coming this way for weeks before your arrival. The trees were mostly oak and ash, their leaves a deep summer green that looked almost black against the grey sky. That track would be the route for the timber and iron yet to arrive, a slow conveyor of materials that you would oversee in the coming days. For now, the track was empty, just a ribbon of mud and crushed leaves winding into shadow. You began to walk the field in a systematic way, not with a ruler, but with the patient measurement of your own steps. Starting at the edge of the track, you paced northward, counting silently, 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, each one roughly a yard, your stride relaxed and regular. At 50 steps you stopped and looked around, noting the sight line to the city walls. The angle was oblique, not directly facing the main gate, which was fine. A trebuchet did not need to point directly at its target from the start. The arm could be aimed by shifting the entire base or adjusting the sling. Still, you wanted a clear view of the arc the projectile would take, so you walked a few more steps east, until a small knoll gave you a slightly elevated position. There, the ground felt good underfoot, flat on top, with enough space around it to lay out the frame without crowding. You retrieved a roll of thin cord from your satchel and 2 small wooden stakes carved from hazel. With the calm, practiced motion of someone who had done this many times before, you knelt and drove the first stake into the earth at the spot that felt like the center of the platform to be. The mallet you used was a small one, its head wrapped in leather to muffle the sound, and each blow was a soft thud absorbed by the soil. You tied the cord to the stake and walked outward, pulling it taut, marking the rough outline of a great rectangle in the grass. The string left a faint impression as you walked a slow circuit, trailing the cord behind you, creating a shape about 60 feet long and 20 feet wide. The rectangle aligned with the gentle slope, its long axis pointing toward the city like a finger laid calmly on a map. You stood at one corner of the string rectangle and looked back along its length. The grass inside the border was no different from the grass outside, but now it held a purpose in your mind. You imagined the heavy base beams lying along those lines, the upright posts rising at the far end, the great throwing arm reaching toward the sky. The image was quiet and still, like a diagram drawn in charcoal on parchment. Not a thing of noise or violence, but of thoughtful arrangement. You adjusted the stake at the near corner by the width of 2 fingers, nudging it until the string ran true, then tied it off with a simple loop that could be undone easily when the time came to replace string with timber. After marking the rectangle, you walked its perimeter slowly, counting your steps again to confirm the proportions. The grass brushed your legs, releasing a faint sweetness from crushed clover. Overhead, a single swallow dipped and turned, tracing invisible patterns in the air, its flight silent at this height. You paused at the midpoint of the long eastern side and faced the city, noting how the wall's crenellations formed a rhythm of gaps and teeth, repeating in even intervals that blurred together the longer you stared. There was no movement, no smoke rising from chimneys, just the still stone baking gently in the diffuse light of the overcast afternoon. You took a deep breath and let it out slowly, the exhale merging with the whisper of wind through the grass. The wind was light and came from the west, carrying the cooler air from the forest. It would not interfere with the work. A trebuchet cared little for wind. Unlike a bow or a standard, its heavy counterweight dropping with a force governed by gravity alone. Still, you noted its direction out of habit, filing the information away like a carpenter noting the grain of a plank. Every detail mattered, but none of them required haste. From your satchel you took a small leather notebook and a stub of charcoal, its end wrapped in linen to keep your fingers clean. You sat down on the grass just outside the string boundary, crossing your legs, and opened the book. The pages were filled with diagrams and measurements from past projects, the charcoal lines smudged but legible. You turned to a blank page and began to sketch the field, marking the tree line, the track, the rectangle, and the distant city in simple, unadorned lines. It was not a drawing meant to impress anyone, just a record for yourself, a way to fix the place in your memory. The charcoal made a soft scratching sound as it moved across the coarse paper, a sound that blended with the ambient quiet. While you sketched, the light shifted almost imperceptibly. The grey sky brightened a shade, then dimmed again as a thicker patch of cloud moved overhead. You looked up and watched the cloud pass, its shadow sweeping across the field like a slow tide, darkening the grass for a few moments before moving on. The city walls disappeared into the shadow and then re-emerged, unchanged. You returned to your drawing, adding a small cross to mark the position of the stake, a dotted line to indicate the slope, an arrow pointing north. These symbols were a language you had used for years, each one a calm anchor to reality. After finishing the sketch, you closed the notebook and returned it to your satchel alongside the charcoal. You stood up and brushed bits of dry grass from your tunic, the fabric rough under your palms. The field now felt less like an anonymous piece of land and more like a workspace prepared and waiting. You walked to the center of the rectangle and stood there, turning slowly to take in the full circle of the horizon. Behind you, the forest stood dark and still. Before you, the city rested in its distant silence. To your left and right, the field stretched away into hedgerows and gentle hills that rolled on into the haze. The afternoon began its slow descent toward evening. The quality of the light changed from a flat grey to a softer, almost pearly luminescence that made shadows longer and edges less distinct. You noticed your own shadow stretching across the grass, a thin dark shape that moved when you moved, attached to your heels like a quiet companion. You walked back toward the track, following your earlier footsteps that had pressed the grass into a faint path. It was a path that would deepen in the coming days as you and the workers came and went, carrying tools and timber. But for now, it was just a suggestion, a whisper of a trail. At the track, you found a flat stone large enough to sit on and settled there, facing the field. You unlaced your water flask from your belt, a leather bottle with a wooden stopper, and took a slow drink. The water was cool and tasted faintly of the tin cup from which it had been poured that morning. You replaced the stopper and hung the flask back at your side, your movements unhurried and automatic. Sitting there, you let your eyes unfocus, resting them on the middle distance where the grass blurred into a soft texture, a greenish-grey carpet that moved in slow waves whenever the wind touched it. Time passed without measurement. You did not count the minutes or watch the sun's angle. You simply existed in the quiet, a part of the landscape as much as the stone you sat on. The first sound that marked a change was the distant creak of wooden wheels and the soft thud of hooves on packed earth. You turned your head toward the forest track and listened. The sound was faint at first, then grew steadily, resolving into the unmistakable rhythm of a cart approaching, its axle in need of grease, its load heavy, but not straining the horse. You remained seated, watching the gap in the trees where the track emerged. After a few minutes, a cart appeared, pulled by a single bay horse with a patient gait. The driver was an older man with a weathered face and a wool cap pulled low, his hands resting loosely on the reins. He did not call out or wave, only nodded as the cart drew closer. On the cart bed, secured with hemp ropes, lay a collection of long wooden poles, thinner than the main beams, but important all the same. The scaffolding, the bracing, the temporary supports that would hold the frame steady during construction. They were freshly cut, their ends pale circles showing the rings of the trees they had been. The cart came to a stop a few paces from where you sat. The horse exhaled heavily and lowered its head, cropping at the grass along the track's edge. The driver set the brake with a wooden chock and climbed down slowly, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. "Where shall I put these?" he asked, his voice low and unhurried, the kind of voice accustomed to long days and simple questions. You rose and gestured toward the rectangle marked by string, along the eastern edge, outside the line, stacked in two piles to keep them from rolling. You walked with him as he led the horse forward, the cart bumping gently over the grass. At the designated spot, he unhitched the tailboard and you both began to unload the poles one by one. The work was quiet, each pole passed hand to hand, laid down carefully on the grass with a soft thud. The wood was smooth under your fingers, peeled of bark, still holding a faint resinous scent. You counted them without speaking, 20 poles in all, each about 12 feet long, their surfaces interrupted here and there by small knots that had been trimmed flush. When the cart was empty, the driver coiled the ropes and stored them under the seat. He did not linger, only accepted the chit you wrote from your notebook, a scrap of paper with a simple mark, and climbed back onto the cart. The horse lifted its head, chewing slowly, and started back along the track without any signal. The sound of the cart faded gradually, the creak and thud receding into the forest until the quiet of the field returned, deeper than before. You stood beside the stacked poles, your hand resting on the topmost one, feeling the grain under your thumb. The evening was coming on now, the grey sky turning a shade closer to silver, the light thinning like water. You decided to do one more thing before nightfall. You would check the ground's level along the rectangle using a simple water level you carried in your satchel. It was a length of clear gut tubing, sealed at both ends with wax, filled partway with water. You uncoiled it and laid it on the grass, then unstopped at one end and held it up, allowing the water to settle. Walking to the far corner of the rectangle, you held the tube against the stake and noted the water line. Then you walked to the opposite corner and did the same, comparing the levels with a squint. The difference was less than the width of your finger, a natural slope that could be corrected with a few shims when the base beams were laid. Satisfied, you recoiled the tube and placed it back in your satchel. The first fireflies began to blink near the forest's edge, their lights tiny green sparks that winked on and off without sound. You gathered your things and walked back to the center of the rectangle, standing for a moment in the gathering dusk. The grass had grown cool, and the air carried the first hint of night's chill. You could just make out the silhouette of the distant city against the darker grey of the evening sky, its walls now a solid band of shadow. No lights appeared there, just the same quiet stillness that had held all day. You turned and made your way slowly toward the track, following your own faint path of flattened grass. The forest welcomed you with a change in the air, a cooler, damper scent of leaf mold and moss. Your tent was pitched not far from the tree line, a simple canvas shelter with a bedroll and a small folding table. You reached it as the last light drained from the sky, leaving everything in shades of blue and black. You lit a single candle inside the tent, its flame steady and small, casting a warm circle of light on the canvas walls. Sitting on the bedroll, you took out your notebook once more and wrote a few lines about the day, the pole delivery, the water level test, the calm weather. The words were brief and practical, a logbook entry that would help you track progress without emotion. When the candle had burned down to a stub, you snuffed it between your thumb and forefinger and lay back on the bedroll. The sounds of the night crept in slowly. The rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft breathing of the forest itself. You closed your eyes and let your mind drift back over the field, the rectangle of string, the stacked poles, the grey sky, the silent walls. The images were quiet and fading, like charcoal lines being gently smudged away. Sleep approached without urgency, a natural settling of thought into stillness, and you let it come, knowing the field would be there in the morning, waiting patiently under its blanket of dew. The morning came without hurry, the grey light seeping through the canvas of your tent like water through cloth, and you woke to the same deep quiet that had wrapped itself around the field the night before. Outside, the air was cool and still, the grass beaded with dew that soaked into the leather of your boots as you walked to the edge of the tree line. A thin mist hung low over the field, softening the distant city walls into a pale smudge, and the stacked poles from the previous day stood dark and silent, waiting. You ate a simple breakfast of bread and hard cheese while sitting on the flat stone, your eyes on the track, and before you had finished the last bite, you heard the first sounds of the day's arrival. The distant jingle of a harness, the slow creak of wheels over roots, a voice murmuring to a horse in low, unhurried tones. The wagon that emerged from the trees was larger than the first, drawn by two sturdy draft horses with feathered hooves and placid expressions. Their breath steamed faintly in the cool air as they plodded forward, and the driver, a young man with a quiet face and hands wrapped in linen strips, pulled them to a gentle stop just beyond the rectangle of string. The cart bed was loaded with squared oak beams, their ends sawn flat, and their surfaces showing the even marks of the sawyer's blade. You rose and walked over, your steps leaving dark prints in the dew, and the driver climbed down without speaking, moving to untie the ropes that held the load in place. The first beam you lifted from the cart was heavy, its weight settling against your shoulder as you carried it to the sorting area you had chosen near the long eastern side of the rectangle. The wood was a light honey color with a few darker streaks running along the grain, and the surface was smooth enough to reflect a dull sheen where the morning light caught it. You laid it down on the grass and ran your palm along its length, feeling for any irregularity, any hidden crack or soft spot that might compromise its strength. The grain was straight, the texture faintly waxy from the natural oil still present in the timber, and the smell that rose from it was a mixture of clean-cut wood and the faint metallic tang of the iron saw that had shaped it. You marked the end of the beam with a small dab of chalk, a simple cross that meant it was suitable for the main frame, and moved back to the cart for the next. The unloading continued in a steady, patient rhythm. Each beam was passed from the driver's hands to yours, or lifted by the two of you together when the length required it, and carried to the grass where it would rest until needed. There were beams of different sizes and purposes mixed together on the cart, so you sorted them as you went. The longest ones, measuring about 20 feet from end to end and 6 inches square in cross-section, were placed in a row with their ends aligned, forming a neat stack that grew incrementally with each trip. These would become the main longitudinal timbers of the trebuchet's base, the great horizontal beams that would hold the uprights and absorb the shock of the falling counterweight. Their surfaces were mostly clean, with only occasional knots that had been trimmed flush and filled with a paste of sawdust and glue at the sawmill, leaving smooth dark circles like closed eyes in the wood. The shorter but thicker beams, the ones intended for the cross bracing and the main axle supports, were stacked in a separate pile a few paces away. These were of a deeper brown, closer to the color of roasted chestnuts, and their ends showed the tight concentric rings of slow-grown oak that had stood in a dense forest for many decades. You took a moment to count the rings on one of them, touching each line with a fingertip, tracing a life that had begun long before your own, and would now serve a different purpose under the open sky. The rings were narrow and closely spaced, indicating wood of great density and strength, exactly what you needed for the parts that would bear the most pressure. You set it down carefully, aligning it with the others, and returned to the cart. Between the larger pieces, smaller beams and planks were nestled, the slender ones for bracing and the thick planks that would form the platform on which you would stand. These you stacked in a third location, closer to the rectangle's edge, building a low wall of timber that caught the light in 100 subtle variations of brown, tan, and silver grey. The wood varied not only in color, but in texture as well. Some pieces were smooth as polished bone, others retained the faint roughness of the saw, and a few still had patches of bark clinging to their edges where the sawyer had cut close to the tree's outer layer. You removed these patches with a small draw knife from your tool roll, the blade peeling away the bark in thin curls that fell to the grass and slowly lost their color in the sun. The driver worked alongside you without haste, his movements economical and soft. He did not fill the silence with chatter, and you did not ask him to, the two of you sharing the quiet as naturally as the horses shared the traces. When the cart was half empty, he paused to let the horses drink from a bucket of water he had slung beneath the wagon. And you stood by, watching the animals lower their muzzles into the bucket with a sound like quiet rain. The water dripped from their lips when they lifted their heads, and they stood motionless afterward, their sides rising and falling with slow, deep breaths that matched the rhythm of the day. After the first cart was empty and the driver had turned it back toward the forest track, you walked among the stacks of timber and began a more detailed inspection. You carried a small wooden ruler marked with notches and a length of cord for measuring, and you checked each beam's straightness by sighting along its edge with one eye closed. Any slight bow or twist you noted with a soft mark of chalk, an arrow pointing to the convex side, because a beam with a natural curve could still be used if placed correctly in the assembly. The art of building with wood was not in finding perfection, but in understanding the character of each piece, its strengths and its inclinations, and working with them rather than against them. You turned one long beam over, sighted again, and decided that its gentle upward curve would make it ideal for the upper rail of the frame, where the arch would help shed water and add a small measure of resilience to the structure. You marked it accordingly and moved on. The sun had climbed higher now, burning off the last of the mist and turning the grey sky to a paler shade that was almost white near the horizon. The grass dried quickly, and the field took on its daytime appearance, a broad sweep of muted green and yellow with the dark line of the forest behind and the pale ribbon of the city ahead. You paused in your work to drink from your water flask and to eat a few dried figs from the pocket of your satchel, the fruit chewy and sweet, their seeds crunching softly between your teeth. While you ate, you watched the field, noting how the shadows of the stacked timber had begun to shorten as the sun moved overhead, and you realized that you had been working for several hours without noticing the passage of time. A second wagon arrived before midday, this one carrying the massive base beams that would form the very foundation of the trebuchet. These were the largest pieces of the entire project, 12-inch square timbers of oak that had been felled and squared years ago and allowed to season in a covered shed until their moisture content was just right. They were a deep, mature brown, almost the color of dark soil, and their surfaces were finely finished, plain smooth and rubbed with linseed oil to protect them from the weather. When you placed your hand on one, the wood felt cool and dense, like stone that had somehow retained a memory of the tree it had been. The grain was interlocking and complex, swirling around old knots in patterns that caught the light and held it, and the smell was richer than the other beams, a deep earthy fragrance with a hint of the oil that had been worked into the pores. Unloading these massive timbers required a different approach. The driver had brought a small tripod hoist mounted on the cart, and together you rigged a simple sling of rope around each beam, taking up the slack with careful turns of a windlass handle. The beam lifted slowly, swinging gently in the air, and you guided it by hand to a prepared bed of smaller logs that would keep it off the damp ground. The movement was so gradual that you could count the individual clicks of the ratchet as the beam rose an inch at a time, the sound a steady tick-tick that echoed across the quiet field. Once the beam was in place, you released the tension and the rope sighed softly, its fibers relaxing after the strain. You repeated this process for each of the 4 massive base beams, each one taking its place on the grass with a finality that was almost ceremonial, a quiet laying of the cornerstone. After the base beams were settled, the driver unhitched the hoist and prepared to leave. He offered you a handful of fresh hazelnuts from a sack under his seat, and you accepted them with a nod of thanks, cracking one between your palms and eating the sweet kernel while you surveyed the growing piles of timber. The field now looked less like a meadow and more like a builder's yard, though the transformation had been so gradual and so quiet that it felt as if the wood had simply grown there overnight, like mushrooms after rain. You cracked another hazelnut and thought about the next steps, the laying out of the base frame, the joining of the beams with mortise and tenon joints, the slow assemblage that would turn these individual pieces into a single, unified machine. The thought was not urgent, just a gentle direction for the mind to wander while the afternoon stretched out ahead. The third wagon did not come until late in the afternoon, when the shadows had begun to lengthen again and the light had taken on that golden quality that comes before evening. This wagon was smaller, a simple two-wheeled cart pulled by a mule with long, expressive ears that twitched constantly, listening to sounds you could not hear. The load was a collection of odd-sized timbers, the pieces that would become the diagonal braces, the struts, the wedges, and the shims you would use to level the frame on the sloping ground. These pieces were of varying lengths and thicknesses, some no bigger than your forearm, others as long as a man is tall, all of them cut from the branchwood and smaller trunks that the sawmill had processed as a secondary harvest. They were lighter in color than the oak, many of them ash or elm, and they had a different scent altogether, a sharper, almost spicy smell that reminded you of autumn walks in the forest. You sorted these smaller pieces with the same care you had given the large beams, grouping them by length and purpose. The wedges, thin triangular slices of hardwood, you tied into a bundle with a cord and hung them from a low branch of a nearby tree so they would be easy to find. The shims, flat pieces of varying thicknesses, you arranged in a neat row on a plank, ordering them from thinnest to thickest like pages in a book. The struts and braces you stacked in a crisscross pattern that allowed air to circulate and kept the wood from warping, each layer perpendicular to the one below, building a lattice that was itself a small structure, a miniature of the larger frame to come. While you worked, the mule stood patiently, its long ears swiveling now and then, and its driver, an older woman with a sun-browned face and a woolen shawl draped over her shoulders, sat on the cart's edge and watched you with calm, uncurious eyes. She had made this delivery many times before, she told you when you paused to straighten your back, and she knew the field and the track as well as she knew her own garden. She pointed out a patch of wild chamomile growing near the tree line, its small white flowers just beginning to open, and suggested you could dry them for tea. You thanked her for the knowledge, and she nodded once, a slow dip of the chin that seemed to contain a whole conversation. When the cart was empty, she clicked her tongue softly, and the mule moved forward, the cart's wheels turning with a sound like a whisper on the grass. Now the light was truly beginning to fade, the sun dropping behind the forest so that the field was illuminated only by the soft, diffuse glow of the sky. You walked slowly among the timber piles, touching each stack as you passed, your fingers trailing over the wood grain. The base beams rested in their bed of logs, heavy and eternal. The long-frame timbers lay in their straight row, their chalk marks faintly visible. The braces and shims waited in their careful arrangements, and the scent of all the different woods mingled in the cooling air, a complex perfume of oak and ash, oil and sap, dust and dew. You sat down on one of the base beams, the wood still warm from the afternoon sun, and let your gaze drift toward the city. Its walls had taken on the blue-grey tint of twilight, and a single light, perhaps a cooking fire seen through a narrow slit, flickered briefly and then steadied, a tiny orange point in the vast grey expanse. The sight was not dramatic, just a small reminder that there were people behind those walls going about their own quiet lives, eating their evening meals, mending their clothes, putting their children to bed. You had no quarrel with them, no desire for conflict. You were simply a builder, a person who made things from wood and rope and iron, and the machine you were constructing was, at this moment, nothing more than a collection of sleeping parts. You pulled out your notebook and the stub of charcoal, and in the dim light you added a few lines to the day's entry. You noted the number and type of beams delivered, their condition, the special markings you had made, and the names of the drivers if you had learned them. You sketched a rough diagram of the sorting layout, showing the positions of the 3 main stacks, and added an arrow indicating the direction of the prevailing wind, which had shifted slightly to the south. The work was repetitive and soothing, the charcoal moving across the paper with a soft scratch, and when you were finished you read over what you had written, the words already becoming memories. Darkness gathered under the trees and crept out into the field, swallowing the grass and the timber stacks until they were just vague shapes against the deeper dark. You lit your candle inside the tent and sat for a while, watching the flame gutter in the slight draught from the open flap, its light making a small golden cave in the middle of the night. The sounds of the forest were the same as the night before, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional crack of a twig as some small animal moved through the undergrowth. There was a comfort in the repetition, a sense that the world was turning in its steady, reliable way, and that you were a part of that turning. Doing your small work in a small corner of a large and peaceful land, you lay down on your bedroll and pulled a blanket up to your chin, the wool smelling faintly of lanolin and wood smoke. The day replayed itself in your mind, not as a sequence of events, but as a texture of sensations, the weight of the beams, the smell of the hazelnuts, the sight of the mule's ears twitching, the sound of the ratchet clicking. These fragments drifted and rearranged themselves, losing their edges, merging into a soft collage of half-formed images that led gently downward into the dark. You thought of the field as it now was, the timber waiting like seeds planted in neat rows, and you thought of the morning when you would begin to join them together, the pegs and the mortises, the slow tapping of the mallet. But that was for another day, and this day had been full enough. Your breathing slowed, and the world slipped away, one quiet piece at a time, until there was only the steady, peaceful rhythm of sleep. The third morning rose pale and still, the sky a single unbroken sheet of silver that gave no hint of sun or shadow, and you stepped from your tent into a field, transformed by 2 days of quiet labor. The timber stacks stood in their orderly rows, their surfaces beaded with dew that caught the flat light and held it like tiny lenses, and the distant city walls lay across the horizon as they had every morning, a mute line of pale stone that asked nothing and offered nothing. You ate your bread slowly, sitting on the same flat stone that had become your accustomed seat, and you looked at the rectangle of string you had laid out on the first day, its corners still marked by hazel stakes driven into the grass. Today, that rectangle would become something more than a suggestion. Today, the base frame would begin its transformation from a collection of individual timbers into a single joined structure that would hold everything else to come. You gathered your tools after breakfast, a coil of new hemp cord, a bundle of sharpened stakes cut from ash saplings, the small leather-wrapped mallet, your measuring rod marked with notches at every inch, and the water level you had used to check the ground's slope. You also took a square made of 2 iron bars fixed at a right angle, its surface polished from years of handling, and a wooden scribe for marking joinery. These you carried in a canvas tool roll that you slung over your shoulder, and you walked out into the field with the grass brushing your legs, the same grass that had already begun to learn the shape of your passing, bending away from a faint path that led from the tree line to the center of the string rectangle. You began by removing the old cord and stakes, the ones you had placed 2 days before as a rough guide. The cord came away easily, its fibers slightly damp, and you coiled it neatly around your hand and tucked it into your satchel for later use. The stakes you pulled with a gentle rocking motion, the soil releasing them with a soft sucking sound, and you dropped them into a small pile that you would sort through again when you needed them. The rectangle was now just an idea again, a shape held only in your memory, but it was an idea that had been refined by your earlier measurements, and you were ready to make it real. With the ground cleared, you took out your measuring rod and began to establish the exact dimensions of the base frame. The Trebuchet's platform needed to be 24 feet long and 8 feet wide, a proportion that would give it stability while allowing the throwing arm to sweep through its full arc without obstruction. You paced the length first, stepping off 24 measured strides from the eastern end to the western, and at each end you knelt and pushed a new ash stake into the earth with the heel of your hand, twisting it slightly to compact the soil around its point. The stake stood upright, a slim, pale wand with a few shreds of bark still clinging to its lower portion, and you sighted along its length to confirm it was vertical before moving on. The width you marked next, stepping 8 strides north from the eastern stake and placing a third stake, then returning to the eastern stake and stepping 8 strides south to place the fourth. You now had 2 endpoints and the beginnings of a long rectangle. To establish the remaining corners at the western end, you used the same method, measuring out 8 strides north and south from the western stake, and then you stood at the center of the shape and looked from corner to corner. The stakes were spaced evenly, their pale wood contrasting with the green grass, and the distances between them felt right in your bones, a sense of proportion honed by years of practice. The next step was to make the rectangle true, and for this you used the cord in the iron square. You tied the cord to the first corner stake and stretched it along what would be the long northern edge, pulling it taut so that it hummed faintly when you plucked it with a finger. At the far corner, you wrapped the cord around the stake several times and tied it off with a slip knot that could be adjusted later. You repeated this for the long southern edge, the cord now marking 2 parallel lines 24 feet apart. And then you did the same for the short eastern and western ends, creating a closed loop of string that hovered just above the grass, a perfect rectangle in intention, if not yet in fact. You knelt at the eastern end and placed the iron square against the corner where the north side cord met the end cord, the 2 lines crossing at the stake. The square's 2 arms lay along the cords, and you peered down at them with one eye closed, checking for any gap between the metal and the twisted fibers. There was a small deviation, the angle opening slightly too wide, so you shifted the northern stake outward by the thickness of your thumb and checked again. The square settled flush against both cords, and you tied the slip knot tighter to hold the adjustment. You moved to the next corner, the northeastern one, and repeated the process, nudging the stake a fraction, checking the square, tying off, your movements as unhurried as the drift of clouds across the pale sky. The diagonal measurement came next, the final and most important check. A rectangle is only true if its diagonals are equal, and you had learned long ago that a frame built on a skewed base would carry its error through every joint and brace, multiplying with each addition until the whole machine sat twisted. You took your cord and measured the distance from the northeast corner to the southwest corner, pulling it taut and marking the length with a pinch of your fingers. Then you moved to the northwest corner and measured to the southeast. The 2 lengths were close, but not identical, the second measurement longer by about 2 inches, which meant the frame was slightly out of square, leaning toward a parallelogram. You corrected this by moving the northern stakes eastward by a small amount, tapping each one with the mallet in a series of soft, muffled thuds that sounded like a heart beating somewhere deep in the earth. You measured the diagonals again, tapping and measuring, until the 2 lengths matched exactly, the cords crossing at the center in a perfect intersection that marked the exact middle of the platform. Satisfied, you drove each stake deeper with the mallet, burying a full foot of ash into the soil, so that the tension of the cords would not pull them loose. The cords now described a true rectangle on the grass, its lines as straight as if drawn with a ruler, and you stood back and regarded it for a long moment. Inside those lines, the grass was still ordinary grass, a patch of green no different from the field around it, but to your eyes it had already begun to take on the character of a floor, a stage on which the trebuchet would stand. The string was not the frame itself, only a promise of the frame, but it was a promise you intended to keep. The first base beam you would lay was the long northern sill, one of the massive 12-inch square timbers that had been delivered the previous day. You walked to the stack where it rested on its bed of logs, the dark brown oak cool to the touch even in the mild morning air, and you considered how best to move it into position without rushing or straining. The beam was far too heavy for one person to lift, so you had arranged for help from a pair of laborers who had arrived that morning with a fresh delivery of small goods, iron nails, a barrel of linseed oil, a roll of coarse canvas. They were quiet men, brothers perhaps, with similar broad faces and the same habit of wiping their hands on their tunics before touching anything. You explained what you needed in a few words, pointing to the beam and then to the northern line of cord, and they nodded without speaking, moving to either end of the timber. You had brought a set of wooden rollers from the cart, smooth logs about 4 inches in diameter and 3 feet long, and you placed these on the grass between the stack and the rectangle, spacing them every few paces. The 3 of you then lifted the beam just enough to slide the first roller under its leading edge, and from there you pushed it forward, the roller turning slowly, the beam advancing by inches as you transferred your weight from one foot to the other. The sound was a low, grinding rumble, the wood complaining softly against the rollers, and the grass beneath was crushed flat, releasing its green scent into the still air. When the beam reached the end of the first roller, you added another at the front, and the process repeated: push, roll, a slow, steady progression that ate up the distance at a walking pace. After perhaps 20 minutes of this patient work, the beam lay alongside the northern chord, its inner face aligned with the string line, and its ends extending a little beyond the corner stakes. You and the labourers tilted it up on edge, using levers cut from stout branches, and then laid it flat on its broad side, the side that would form the top surface of the sill. The beam settled into the grass with a soft, final crunch, and you knelt beside it to check its alignment. The inner edge was perfectly flush with the chord, running true from end to end, and the top surface was level enough to the eye, though you would check it properly with the water level in a moment. You thanked the labourers with a nod, and they returned to the tree line, where they began stacking the newly arrived barrels under the shade of an oak. You took up your water level and unstopped both ends, letting the water inside settle until it was still, a tiny horizontal mirror that showed a sliver of the grey sky. You held one end of the tube against the northeastern corner of the beam, marking the waterline with your thumb, and then walked the length of the beam to the northwestern corner, holding the other end against the wood and comparing the two levels. The waterline at the far end was slightly higher, which meant the beam was sloping downward toward the east by about 1/4 of an inch. That was within acceptable tolerance, but you preferred to work as close to perfect as the materials allowed. So you gathered a few of the thin stone flakes you had collected from the stream bed, flat pieces of shale that split easily into delicate wedges, and you slid them under the lower end of the beam, tapping them gently with the mallet until the water level read true across the full length. The stone shims disappeared under the dark oak, their grey edges just visible against the soil, and the beam now sat perfectly level, a solid foundation for everything that would be built above it. The southern sill beam followed the same pattern, rolling it from the stack to the southern chord line, aligning the inner edge, leveling with the water level, shimming with stone where the ground dipped ever so slightly. This time the beam needed 2 shims, one at each end, because the soil here had a subtle wave to it, a long shallow depression that ran diagonally across the rectangle. You tapped the shims into place and checked the level again, walking back and forth with the tube, your boots pressing a path along the grass that was now distinctly marked with your daily passages. By the time the southern sill was secure, the morning had passed into early afternoon, and the light had brightened to a soft white that made everything look clean and newly made. You ate your midday meal sitting on the southern sill, the bread and cheese tasting of nothing in particular except the pleasant blankness of simple food, and you drank from your flask while looking at the rectangle. The 2 long sills lay parallel, 8 feet apart, their inner faces framing a strip of grass that would become the floor of the platform. The short end beams, the headers that would close the rectangle at east and west, still lay in their stack, waiting their turn. You finished your meal and brushed the crumbs from your tunic, and then you signaled to the labourers again, who came over with the same patient expressions, ready to continue. The eastern header was the next to be placed, a beam 8 feet long that would fit between the ends of the 2 sills. You had cut mortises into the sill ends the day before, rectangular sockets chiseled out with a mallet and a wide framing chisel, their sides straight and their bottoms flat. The header had tenons at both ends, projections of wood that would fit into those sockets and lock the corner together without nails. You had shaped the tenons yourself, sawing and paring until they were exactly the right size, a snug fit that would require a few taps of the mallet to seat fully but would hold fast once in place. Now you lifted the header with the labourers, one at each end and you in the middle, and carried it to the eastern end of the rectangle. You lowered the tenons into the mortises, the wood slipping in with a quiet scraping sound, and then you took up your mallet and began to tap the beam downward. The taps were light at first, just enough to start the joints, and then firmer as the tenons bit deeper, the mallet's leather head making a soft, rhythmic thumping that echoed across the field. With each tap, the header settled further, until its top surface was flush with the tops of the sills and the joint was closed tight, a seam so fine that you could barely slide a fingernail into it. You walked around the corner and checked the squareness one more time, measuring the diagonal from the new corner to the opposite one. The measurement was still true, the frame still perfectly rectangular, and you allowed yourself a small internal satisfaction, a quiet warmth that came not from pride, but from the simple pleasure of seeing a thing done correctly. The western header was installed in the same way, its tenons fitting into their mortises with the same soft scrape and the same series of mallet taps. And when it was seated, the base frame was complete, a rectangle of 4 massive beams, joined at the corners, lying flat and level on the grass, enclosing a space of 24 feet by 8 feet, that was now officially the floor of the trebuchet. Enclosing a space of 24 feet by 8 feet, that was now officially the floor of the trebuchet. The labourers returned to their tasks at the tree line, and you were left alone with the frame. You walked its perimeter slowly, stepping over the sills and onto the grass inside, then back out again, your boots making a hollow sound on the thick oak. The wood was warm from the afternoon sun, and when you placed your palm flat on it, you could feel the faint vibration of the earth beneath, the deep, silent hum of the ground that was always there if you listened for it. You sat down in the center of the rectangle, cross-legged on the grass that would soon be covered by deck planks, and looked up at the sky, the same pale grey, the same featureless expanse, and you found its uniformity comforting, a blank slate that imposed no deadlines and no demands. After a while, you rose and began to prepare the frame for the next stage, the drilling of peg holes at the corners to lock the mortise and tenon joints permanently. You took out an auger, a T-shaped tool with a twisted iron bit, and you knelt at the first corner, positioning the bit over the center of the joint. You turned the auger slowly, the bit biting into the oak with a soft crunching sound, and the wood shavings curled up out of the hole, pale and fragrant, falling onto the grass like thin ribbons. You drilled down through the tenon and into the sill, stopping when the bit reached the depth you had marked with a line of chalk on the shaft. The hole was clean and straight, and you repeated the process at each of the 4 corners, drilling a total of 8 holes, 2 per joint, each one a perfect cylinder that would receive a hardwood peg. The pegs themselves you had carved the previous evening from a piece of dried hickory, a wood so hard and dense that it rang like a bell when struck. They were tapered slightly at one end and square in cross-section, designed to be driven into round holes where they would compress and hold with immense force. You fitted the first peg into its hole and began to tap it with the mallet, the sound changing from a hollow thud to a sharper, higher note as the peg seated itself. You drove it until the top was flush with the beam surface, and then you did the same with the remaining 7, the taps echoing across the field in a slow, steady rhythm that was almost musical. When all the pegs were driven, the joints were locked, and the base frame was no longer 4 separate beams, but a single, unified piece of engineering, solid enough to withstand the heaviest stresses the trebuchet could impose. The afternoon was now well advanced, the light beginning its slow fade toward evening, and you gathered your tools and returned them to the tent, wiping each one with an oiled cloth before putting it away. You walked back to the frame and stood at its center, turning slowly to take in the full circle of the horizon. The forest was a dark line behind you, the city a pale line ahead, and the field stretched away on either side into a haze of green and grey that blurred the edges of the world. The base frame sat quietly in the middle of it all, a dark rectangle of oak on the green grass, and it looked as if it had always been there, a natural feature of the landscape rather than something made by human hands. You sat on the western sill and watched the light change, the grey sky deepening to a soft charcoal, and you thought about the next chapter in the construction, the raising of the main upright posts, the tall vertical timbers that would support the axle and define the profile of the machine. That would be a different kind of work, involving ropes in the hoist, but it was still days away, and there was no need to think about it now. For now, the base frame was enough. It was square and true, level and solid, and it would wait patiently through the night, holding its shape against the dew and the darkness. When the first fireflies appeared at the forest's edge, you stood up and walked the slow path back to your tent, the grass now fully dark, the frame a deeper black against the twilight field. You lit your candle and wrote in your notebook, recording the completion of the base frame, the dimensions, the shims used, the peg count, and a small sketch of the corner joint. The words were spare and factual, a builder's diary, and when you had finished, you closed the book and lay back on your bedroll. The sounds of the night were the same as always, the rustle of leaves, the distant owl, the quiet breathing of the forest. You let them wash over you, one wave after another, until the line between waking and sleep blurred into nothing, and the field and the frame and the distant walls all faded into a deep and dreamless rest. The morning of the 4th day arrived with a quality of light that was neither bright nor dim, a diffuse silver glow that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and you woke to find the base frame covered in a thin layer of dew that had gathered in the shallow grain of the oak. The rectangle of dark timber lay in the grass like a picture drawn on the earth, its corners true, its surface level, and you stood beside it for a while, drinking from your flask and letting the stillness of the field settle into your bones. Today the frame would receive its vertical dimension, the two great upright posts that would rise from the eastern end and hold the main axle, and the work would be slower than anything you had done so far, a process measured in inches and hours rather than steps and minutes. The upright posts themselves were the tallest pieces of the entire project, each one a squared oak beam, 18 feet long and 10 inches on each side, their surfaces plane smooth and their ends cut with the same precision you had applied to the frame joints. They had arrived the previous afternoon on a separate wagon, and you had left them lying on a bed of straw near the eastern end of the frame, their pale honey color a contrast to the darker base sills. You walked over to them now and ran your hand along one, feeling the cool, even texture, the slight waxiness of the wood, the absence of any twist or bow. The post was heavy with potential, a sleeping giant that would soon stand upright and take its place in the structure. To raise these posts, you would use an A-frame hoist, a simple lifting device made from 3 long poles lashed together at the top to form a tripod, with a pulley block hanging from the apex and a rope running through it to a windlass. The components for the hoist had been brought to the field in sections and now lay in the grass, waiting to be assembled. You gathered the laborers, the same 2 quiet brothers who had helped with the base beams, and together you began to build the lifting rig. The 3 poles were each about 20 feet long, slender ash trunks that had been stripped of bark and left to season until they were light and strong. You laid them on the ground, with their tops overlapping, and you bound them together with a length of thick hemp rope, wrapping it around and around in a figure-8 pattern, pulling each turn tight with a wooden lever that creaked as it bit into the fibers. The lashing took time, each loop needing to be firm and even so that the tripod would stand without wobbling, and you worked the rope with the same patient rhythm you applied to every knot, every turn, every pull. When the lashing was secure, you and the laborers lifted the bound end off the ground and walked the legs apart, raising the tripod like a giant compass opening its points. The legs settled into shallow holes you had dug in the soil, their feet braced with flat stones to prevent them from sinking under load, and the structure stood over the eastern end of the frame, its apex a good 25 feet above the grass. You attached the pulley block to the lashing with an iron shackle, the metal cool and heavy in your hands, and you threaded the main lifting rope through the sheave, a thick rope of twisted flax that was smooth from use and smelled faintly of tar. The rope fell in a long loop to the ground and you led its free end to the windlass, a horizontal drum mounted on a stout frame that you staked firmly to the earth a few paces away. The windlass was a simple machine, a cylinder of oak with iron handles radiating from its ends, and turning it required 2 people walking in a slow circle, each revolution winding a few inches of rope onto the drum. You tested the mechanism by having the laborers take the handles while you held the rope taut, and the windlass clicked softly as it turned, a wooden pawl engaging a ratchet wheel, with a sound like a pebble dropping into still water. Everything worked smoothly. The rope moving without jerks or snags, the pulley spinning silently on its greased axle, and you were ready to lift the first post. The post lay on the grass just beyond the frame, its foot end near the eastern header and its top pointing away toward the forest. You had already cut a mortise in the base sill to receive the post, a rectangular socket 6 inches deep, and the exact dimensions of the post's tenon, which you had shaped at the foot of the timber with careful saw cuts and chisel paring. The tenon was a snug fit, tested earlier by setting the post upright by hand just long enough to slide it into the mortise and then lowering it again, and you knew that it would seat with a few firm taps once the post was vertical. Now you wrapped a heavy canvas sling around the post about 2/3 of the way up from its foot, a point where the balance would keep it hanging straight, and you attached the lifting rope to the sling with a strong iron hook that you secured with a Mau's knot, the twine wrapping neat and tight around the hook's throat. You gave the signal to the laborers at the windlass, and they began to turn the handles, their feet pacing slowly around the drum, their faces calm and unstrained. The rope tightened gradually, the fibers stretching with a soft creaking sound, and the post stirred on the grass, its weight shifting as the slack was taken up. Then the foot end lifted just clear of the ground. the wood scraping softly against the straw, and the post began to rise inch by slow inch. The windlass clicked with each step, a steady rhythm that counted out the progress, and you stood at the frame with a guiding pole, a long ash sapling with a forked end, ready to steady the post if it began to swing. The post rose at a pace that was almost imperceptible, each full turn of the windlass raising it by about the thickness of your thumb. You watched the gap between the foot and the ground grow from nothing to a hand's breadth, then to a foot, then to 2 feet. The timber hanging at a shallow angle with its top still resting on the earth. The laborers walked their circle without haste, their breathing even, their boots pressing the grass into a dark ring around the windlass. The sun climbed a little higher, the grey sky brightening to a soft pearl, and the shadow of the tripod moved across the grass with the same leisurely pace as the lifting. When the post reached an angle of about 45 degrees, its top end left the ground entirely and it swung free, the rope now bearing its full weight. The post swayed gently, a slow pendulum motion that made the tripod creak and the pulley sing a faint, high note, and you used the guiding pole to steady it, pressing the fork against the timber with just enough force to dampen the movement. The swaying stopped, and the post hung there, suspended between earth and sky, its length a diagonal line that cut the pale grey backdrop into 2 neat triangles. You called for the labourers to continue, and the windlass resumed its clicking, the rope taking another turn, the post rising another few inches. The most delicate part of the lift came when the post was nearly vertical, its foot hovering just above the mortise in the sill. You stopped the windlass and moved in close, positioning yourself beside the joint and peering down into the socket. The tenon dangled perhaps 6 inches above its target, swaying ever so slightly, and you used your hands to guide it, feeling the weight of the post through the vibration in the wood. The labourers turned the windlass a quarter turn at a time now, the rope releasing in tiny increments, and the tenon descended toward the mortise with the slowness of a setting sun. The wood touched the wood with a soft, solid sound, and the tenon slid into the socket, the fit so precise that it required only the weight of the post to start the seating. You called for a stop and took up your wooden mallet, the same leather-wrapped tool you had used to drive the pegs. Standing to one side, you began to tap the base of the post, the blows light and careful, each one settling the tenon deeper by a fraction. The sound was a dull, rhythmic thumping, and after a dozen taps, the post was fully seated, its shoulder resting flush against the sill. The joint closed tight. You stepped back and looked up the length of the post, 18 feet of oak pointing straight into the pale sky, and it was not yet perfectly vertical, but it was standing on its own, a new vertical line in a landscape of horizontals. The labourers untied the sling and coiled the lifting rope, and you took out your plumb bob, a simple tool consisting of a pointed iron weight suspended on a thin cord. You hung the cord from a small nail you had driven into the top of the post, and you watched the weight settle into stillness, its point hovering just above a mark you had scratched into the sill. The plumb bob hung motionless, and you knelt to sight along its line, closing one eye and aligning the cord with the edge of the post. There was a slight deviation, the top of the post leaning toward the south by perhaps half an inch. You tapped the base of the post with the mallet, nudging it northward, and the plumb bob swayed, then settled again, its point now a little closer to the center mark. You tapped again, checked again, tapped again, and the process repeated in a slow loop of adjustment and measurement that could have lasted minutes or hours. You did not keep track. When the post was perfectly vertical, the plumb bob hanging with its point exactly over the mark, you drove a pair of temporary wedges between the tenon and the sides of the mortise to hold the alignment. The wedges were thin triangles of hard ash, and you tapped them in gently, their edges biting into the oak with a soft crunch. The post now stood as a true vertical, a silent sentinel that would hold half the weight of the axle and the throwing arm, and you allowed yourself a moment to look at it, to take in the way its straight lines intersected with the straight lines of the frame, the beginnings of a 3-dimensional geometry that would grow more complex with each passing day. The second post was lifted in the same manner, though the process now had the comfort of repetition. You attached the sling, you guided the lift, you steadied the sway, you lowered the tenon into the mortise, and you tapped it home with the mallet. The windlass clicked its steady rhythm, the rope creaked and stretched. The tripod held firm, and the second post rose as slowly and as surely as the first, its pale length climbing into the sky inch by inch. By the time the second tenon was seated, the afternoon had aged into a soft golden light, the sun having burned through the grey overcast to cast long shadows across the field. The two upright posts stood at the eastern end of the frame, parallel and true, their tops level with each other, their faces clean and unadorned, waiting for the axle that would bridge them. You spent the remainder of the afternoon with the plumb bob, checking and rechecking the verticality of both posts. The tool hung from the nail on the first post, and you watched the cord settle, the weight so still that it might have been carved from the air itself. You measured the gap between the cord and the post's face at several points along its length, using a small wedge of wood as a gauge, and you found a slight bow in the timber that you had not noticed before, a gentle curve of perhaps 1/8 of an inch that was natural to the tree it had come from. The bow did not affect the structural integrity, and you noted it in your mind, filing it away as a detail to consider when you fitted the axle bearings. The second post had its own small character, a faint twist near the top that had been present since the tree was a sapling reaching for light through a crowded canopy, and you accepted these imperfections the way you accepted the slope of the field or the texture of the soil as given conditions to work with rather than against. You used a straight edge, a long plank that you had planed perfectly flat, to check that the two posts were in the same plane, resting it across their inward faces and sighting along its length. The plank sat flush against both surfaces, confirming that the posts were not only vertical, but also aligned with each other, their mortises for the axle bearings exactly opposite one another. This alignment had been built into the base frame's geometry, the mortises for the posts cut at precisely measured distances, and the care you had taken with the initial layout was now paying its quiet dividend. You removed the straight edge and ran your hand over the inside faces of the posts, feeling the smooth wood, the faint warmth of the afternoon sun that still lingered in the grain. The tripod hoist you left standing in case adjustments were needed later, but you loosened the main rope and let it hang slack, the hook swinging gently in the breeze that had begun to stir from the west. The laborers had returned to the tree line, their work for the day complete, and you were alone with the frame and the posts, the field around you settling into the long, slow decline toward evening. You sat on the western sill and looked at what you had built so far, the base rectangle of dark oak, the two uprights rising from its eastern end, the whole assembly a skeleton waiting for its muscles and sinews. The proportions were pleasing in a way that had nothing to do with decoration, a purely functional beauty that came from lines being straight and angles being true. As the light softened and the shadows stretched, you thought about the next step, which would be the installation of the great throwing arm and the axle on which it would pivot. But the axle bearings still needed to be fashioned from the blocks of dense elm you had stored under the canvas, and the throwing arm itself was not yet fully shaped, its taper still rough and its socket for the axle still needing to be bored. These tasks lay ahead in a calm sequence, each one dependent on the one before, none of them urgent or pressing. You were a link in a long, slow chain of cause and effect, and the chain would hold whether you pulled it quickly or gently. You rose and walked around the assembly, checking each joint one final time before nightfall. The pegs in the base frame were still tight, the stone shims still in place, the grass beneath the sills beginning to yellow where it was deprived of light. The tenons in the upright posts were invisible now, buried deep in their mortises, and the wedges held them fast. You placed your hand on one of the posts and felt the solidity of it, the way it transmitted no vibration except the deep, inaudible hum of the earth. It was a good feeling, the feeling of something well made and properly set, and you carried it with you as you walked back to the tent. Inside the tent, the candle flame guttered in a small draught, and you wrote your daily entry in the notebook. You recorded the raising of the two upright posts, the alignment checks, the bow and twist you had observed, the time of day when the second post was seated, and a rough sketch of the frame with the posts in elevation. The words were few, the sketch simple, and the act of writing was itself a kind of settling, a way to close the day and let the mind release its hold on the details. You put the notebook away and lay down, the blanket pulled up, the sounds of the forest night filtering through the canvas. The two posts stood outside in the darkness, invisible now, but still there, holding their verticality against the pull of the earth. You pictured them in your mind, two pale lines against the black, and the image was so still and so simple that it became a kind of meditation, a focus for the drifting thoughts that preceded sleep. The day's work had been slow and careful, and the night's rest would be the same, a slow descent into quiet, a resting of the body and the mind after the steady labor of rising wood. You breathed in the scent of the canvas and the faint, distant sweetness of the grass, and you let the darkness carry you away, one breath at a time, into a sleep that was as deep and as level as the frame you had built. The morning light came through the canvas of your tent with a muted softness, a pale grey that held no promise of sun, but offered instead a steady, even illumination. Perfect for the kind of work you were about to begin. You woke with the slow awareness of someone who had slept deeply and without dreams, and after a simple meal of bread and a handful of dried currants, you made your way out into the field where the trebuchet frame waited in its quiet geometry. The two upright posts stood at the eastern end, their vertical lines a calm assertion against the flat horizon, and the base rectangle lay dark and solid beneath them, the grass around it yellowing where the heavy timbers blocked the light. Today you would not lift or join or measure. Today you would shape the great throwing arm, the long beam that would become the heart of the machine, and the work would be slow and repetitive, a meditation on wood and blade, and the patient removal of material. The throwing arm lay where it had been left, a massive squared timber of ash, 28 feet from end to end, its raw form rough from the sawmill and still bearing the faint marks of the sawyer's blade. Ash had been chosen for this piece because of its remarkable combination of strength and flexibility, a wood that could bend under the immense force of the counterweight without snapping, and its grain was straight and true, the annual rings visible as fine parallel lines running from one end to the other. The beam was thickest at what would be the butt end, the end that would carry the counterweight basket, a full 14 inches square, and it tapered gradually toward the tip, which was currently a blunt 8 inches square. The taper needed to be refined into a smooth, continuous curve from the thick butt to the slender tip, and this refinement would be accomplished with a draw knife, a tool you had used so many times that it felt like an extension of your own hands. You set up a working area near the frame, laying down a long trestle of 2 sawhorses padded with sacking, and with the help of the laborers, you rolled the massive beam onto the support so that it sat at waist height, its surface within easy reach. The beam was heavy, the weight of it pressing the sawhorse legs into the soft earth. But once it was settled, it remained still and steady, a patient slab of pale wood waiting to be transformed. You warped the length of the beam, trailing your fingers over its surface, feeling the roughness of the saw marks and the occasional raised splinter, and you began to plan the sequence of cuts that would turn this rectangular blank into a graceful, tapered spar. The draw knife was a simple instrument, a blade of high-carbon steel with a wooden handle at each end, and you took it from your tool roll and tested its edge with your thumb. The edge was sharp, but not too sharp, honed to a fine burr that would bite into the wood without tearing, and you seated yourself on a low stool at one end of the beam, positioning yourself so that you could pull the knife toward you in long, even strokes. The first cut was always the most tentative, a shallow pass to test the grain and the resistance, and you placed the blade against the corner of the beam and drew it toward you with a steady, even pressure. A thin shaving of wood curled up from the blade, pale and translucent, its surface smooth on one side and rough on the other, and it fell away onto the grass with a soft whisper. The smell of fresh ash rose into the air, a clean, slightly sweet scent that was unlike the deeper, earthier smell of oak, and you paused to inhale it, letting the fragrance settle into your senses before making the next stroke. You worked your way along the beam in sections, establishing the primary facets that would define the taper. Starting at the butt end, you shaved away the sharp corners, turning the square cross-section into an octagon, and then you refined that octagon into a shape with 16 sides, each cut overlapping the previous one by the width of the blade. The draw knife moved in a rhythm that was both steady and variable, the length of each stroke determined by the resistance of the wood and the depth of cut you were taking. Where the grain was straight and even, the blade slid through with a smooth, singing sound, and the shavings came away long and unbroken, curling into loose spirals that piled up around your feet. Where the grain was more complex, swelling around a knot or a slight undulation in the growth rings, you shortened your strokes and adjusted the angle of the blade, feeling the wood's texture through the handles and responding to it without conscious thought. The process was repetitive in the most peaceful way, a cycle of positioning the blade, drawing it toward you, lifting it away, brushing aside the shavings, and positioning it again. There was no need to count the strokes or measure the progress at every moment. You simply worked, your body settling into a comfortable rhythm, your mind drifting in and out of focus on the task. The grey sky overhead remained unchanged, a constant backdrop that made the passage of time feel irrelevant, and the only sounds were the whisper of the blade, the soft rustle of shavings falling, and the distant calls of birds in the forest. Occasionally you would stop to sharpen the drawknife on a small whetstone you kept in your pocket. A few drops of oil spread on the stone, the blade drawn across it in careful circles that restored the edge, and then you would resume, the blade biting into the fresh wood with renewed eagerness. As the morning progressed, the shape of the throwing arm began to emerge from the rough timber. The butt end remained thick and massive, its cross-section becoming a smooth, rounded square that would fit snugly into the iron straps of the counterweight basket, and from there the beam tapered gradually, losing width and depth in a gentle curve that you checked frequently with your hands, running your palms along the surface to feel for any lumps or hollows. The human hand is a sensitive instrument, capable of detecting deviations too small for the eye to see, and you trusted your touch as much as any measuring tool. Where your palm sensed a high spot, you took another pass with the drawknife, removing the barest whisper of wood, and then you felt again, the surface growing smoother and smoother under your fingers. You paused at midday to eat and rest, sitting on the base frame with your back against one of the upright posts. The bread tasted of nothing in particular, and the water from your flask was cool and clean, and you chewed slowly while looking at the half-shaped arm on its trestles. The taper was beginning to look right, the lines flowing from thick to thin in a way that pleased the eye, and the pile of shavings beneath the beam was now a small mountain of pale curls, their fragrance still hanging in the still air. The laborers were at the forest edge, eating their own meal in silence, and the field was otherwise empty. The distant city walls a pale line on the horizon, the grass swaying gently in a breeze, too light to feel. After the meal, you resumed the shaping, moving now to the finer refinements. You took up a spoke shave, a smaller tool with a curved sole and a short blade, designed for smoothing concave surfaces and reaching into the subtle curves where the drawknife could not follow. The spoke shave made a different sound, a softer, higher shushing that blended with the rustle of the grass, and with it you worked the transition zones, the places where the taper changed from steep to shallow, smoothing out any bumps or ridges left by the larger tool. You sighted along the beam frequently, closing one eye and peering down its length, checking the line of the taper against the horizon, and you made tiny adjustments, a shaving here, a shaving there, until the curve was as fair and as continuous as you could make it. The tip of the arm required special attention, because it would need to release the sling at exactly the right moment, and any irregularity could affect the trajectory of the projectile. You spent a long time on the last 3 feet of the beam, using a fine rasp and then a scraper, a flat piece of steel with a burred edge that removed wood and the finest possible dust rather than shavings. The scraper made a soft scraping sound, a gentle zizzing that was almost musical, and you worked it with both hands, pushing and pulling it across the surface, feeling the wood become smoother with each pass. When you ran your hand over the tip, the surface felt almost polished, the grain sealed and glossy, and you knew it would slit through the sling ring with minimal friction. As the afternoon wore on, the light shifted from pale grey to a soft, warm gold, the sun finally breaking through the overcast and casting long shadows across the field. The throwing arm was now fully shaped, its taper true, its surface smooth from butt to tip, and it lay on the trestles like a great wooden spear, a thing of purpose and grace. But the work was not yet complete, for the arm still needed to be sealed against the weather, and the socket for the axle still needed to be bored through the thickest part of the beam. You decided to do the sealing now, while the light was good, and leave the boring for the next day. The sealing mixture you had prepared the previous evening, melting tallow in a small iron pot over a low fire and stirring in fine silver sand until the mixture thickened into a gritty paste. The tallow, rendered from beef fat, would soak into the wood's pores and repel moisture, while the sand would provide a slight texture that would help the rope bindings grip the surface. You carried the pot to the trestles, the mixture still warm and giving off a faint, fatty smell, and you began to apply it with a folded cloth, rubbing it into the wood in slow, circular motions. The paste went on pale and opaque, filling the tiny scratches left by the scraper, and as you rubbed, the friction warmed the wood and helped the tallow penetrate deeper. The surface of the arm gradually changed color, darkening from pale ash blonde to a rich, honeyed amber, and the grain of the wood emerged more clearly, the annual rings now standing out as distinct lines of darker and lighter brown. You worked the tallow mixture along the entire length of the arm, replenishing the cloth frequently, your hand moving in the same steady circles, the motion hypnotic and calming. The smell of the tallow blended with the lingering scent of fresh wood, creating a new fragrance that was both clean and faintly animal. Not unpleasant, just different. The light continued to fade, the gold deepening to amber and then to a soft rose, and the shadows of the upright posts stretched across the frame like long fingers, pointing toward the west. You did not hurry. There was no need to finish before dark, because you could easily work by candlelight if you wished. But the rhythm of the day was winding down naturally, and you let it wind down. When the arm was fully coated, you stepped back and wiped your hands on a rag, looking at the result. The beam was transformed, its surface now a uniform, warm brown with a subtle sheen. The taper sleek and aerodynamic, the tip a smooth, rounded point. It was a beautiful object in its own right, the thing made by hand and eye and patience, and you felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride, and everything to do with the simple pleasure of seeing a task completed well. The arm would now rest for a day or two, allowing the tallow to harden and cure, and then you would bore the axle socket and fit the iron reinforcing straps. You covered the arm with a length of clean canvas to protect it from the morning dew, tucking the edges under the beam and weighting them with small stones. The trestles creaked slightly as the wind picked up, a gentle breeze from the east that carried the coolness of the coming evening, and you gathered your tools and wiped each one with an oily rag before returning them to the tool roll. The draw knife, the spoke shave, the rasp, the scraper, the whetstone, all of them had played their part, and you treated them with the same care you gave to the timber, because good tools were the foundation of good work. You walked back to the tent as the first stars began to appear, pale pinpricks in the deepening blue, and you lit your candle and sat on the bedroll with your notebook open on your knee. The entry for the day was brief. A note on the taper dimensions, the tools used, the application of the tallow mixture, and a small sketch of the arm in profile, showing the curve of the taper and the position of the yet-to-be bored axle socket. The charcoal scratched softly on the paper, and the candle flame danced in the draught from the tent flap. And when you'd finished writing, you closed the book and placed it under your pillow, where it would be safe and dry. The sounds of the night were the familiar ones now. The rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional creak of the tripod hoist settling, and you lay back and let them wash over you. The image of the throwing arm stayed in your mind for a while, the long tapered shape of it, the warm brown of the sealed wood, the way it had looked against the grey sky. And then that image faded, replaced by a more general sense of calm, a feeling that the project was moving forward at exactly the right pace, neither too fast nor too slow, but in perfect harmony with the turning of the earth. You breathed in the cool night air, and you let your thoughts dissolve, and sleep came as it always did, quietly and without announcement, wrapping you in its grey blanket and carrying you into a rest that was as smooth and as deep as the surface of the wood you had shaped. The axle arrived on a morning that was neither warm nor cool, the air holding a temperature that seemed to have no particular character at all, and you stood by the frame as the cart came creaking along the track with its single piece of cargo wrapped in oilcloth. The driver was the same older man who had brought the poles on the first day, his face weathered and his movements slow, and he pulled the mule to a stop with a soft word that was lost in the stillness. Together you lifted the wrapped bundle from the cart bed, feeling the dense, concentrated weight of it, and you carried it to the trestles where the throwing arm lay covered in its canvas shroud. The oilcloth came away with a rustle, and the axle was revealed, a cylinder of ironwood so dark it was nearly black, its surface polished to a dull gleam by the lathe that had shaped it. Ironwood, you knew, was chosen for its incredible hardness and its natural oils that made it almost immune to wear. A wood so dense that it sank in water, and the cylinder before you was a perfect example of the turner's art. Straight and true along its entire 6-foot length, its diameter a consistent 8 inches, except at the very ends where it was reduced slightly to form the bearing journals. You ran your palm along its surface, feeling the faint ridges of the growth rings that the lathe had not quite erased, and the wood was cool and heavy, and smelled faintly of the dark forest where the tree had grown, a scent that was earthy and ancient. The throwing arm still lay on its trestles under the canvas, and he pulled the cover back to expose the thickened midsection where the axle socket had been bored the previous afternoon. The socket was a round hole, 6 inches in diameter, bored cleanly through the beam with a large auger, and then finished with a curved chisel until its walls were smooth and perfectly cylindrical. You had taken your time with that boring, letting the auger bite slowly into the ash, clearing the chips frequently, measuring the depth and the angle with a square to ensure the hole was exactly perpendicular to the length of the arm. Now the socket was ready to receive the axle, but first it needed to be lined with leather to provide a smooth bearing surface and to absorb the small irregularities that would otherwise cause the arm to bind or chatter during the throw. You went to the supply stack and took out a piece of thick cowhide that had been soaking in a bucket of water since the previous evening. The leather now soft and pliable, and darkened to a deep brown. With a sharp knife you cut a rectangle from the hide, measuring it against the circumference of the axle with a cord, and then you trimmed it carefully until it would wrap around the axle exactly once with a small overlap. The leather was about a 1/4 inch thick, its surface smooth on one side and rough on the other, and you smeared the rough side with a generous coating of tallow grease, working the fat into the fibers with your fingers until the leather was slick and slippery. Then you rolled the leather into a tube and inserted it into the socket, pressing it outward against the walls with your fingertips, smoothing out any wrinkles or bubbles, and when it was fully seated, the inside of the socket was now a perfect greasy cylinder, a soft bed for the ironwood axle to turn in. The axle itself needed to be inserted through this socket while the arm was still on the trestles, and you called one of the labourers to help you lift the heavy cylinder. The two of you carried it to one end of the arm, aligning the tip of the axle with the leather-lined hole, and then you pushed it slowly through, the wood sliding against the greased leather with a soft, sucking sound. The fit was snug but not tight, the axle moving forward in small increments as you shifted your grip and pushed again, and when it emerged from the far side, you adjusted its position until an equal length projected from both sides of the arm. The throwing arm now had a crosspiece running through its midsection, the long ash beam and the shorter ironwood cylinder forming a T-shape that would become the pivot point of the entire machine, and you stood back and looked at the assembly with a quiet sense of something approaching completion, though there was still much to do. The next task was to lift the arm and axle assembly up to the top of the upright posts, where the bearings would hold the axle journals and allow the arm to rotate freely. You rigged the tripod hoist again, the same one you'd used to raise the posts, and you attached the lifting sling to the axle at 2 points, one on either side of the arm, so that the whole assembly would hang level as it rose. The labourers took their places at the windlass handles, and you stood by with the guiding pole, your eyes on the slowly tightening ropes. The lift began with the usual creak of fibres and the soft clicking of the ratchet, and the arm rose from the trestles inch by inch, the axle journals now hanging in the air, the long tip of the arm pointing toward the sky at an angle. The assembly swayed a little as it cleared the trestles, and you steadied it with the pole, the forked end cradling the ash beam gently, and the labourers continued their slow walk around the windlass, their boots pressing the grass in a well-worn circle that had become deeper with each passing day. The axle rose past the level of your head, then past the tops of the uprights, and then it hung suspended above the bearings, waiting to be lowered into place. The bearings themselves were simple blocks of dense elm, each one carved with a half-round groove on its upper surface that matched the diameter of the axle journals, and they were set into square housings that you had cut into the tops of the upright posts. You had fitted these bearing blocks a day earlier, tapping them into the housings with a mallet and a thin shim of wood to ensure they sat firmly, and now their grooved surfaces were smeared with a thick layer of tallow and graphite powder, a mixture that would reduce friction to almost nothing. The axle journals, those reduced ends of the ironwood cylinder, were also greased, and as the assembly lowered, you guided each journal into its groove with your hands, feeling the weight settle into the wood. The rope slackened, and the axle came to rest in its bearings with a soft, definite thud, a sound that was more felt than heard, a deep, low vibration that traveled through the frame and into the ground. The arm now hung between the two uprights, its long tip pointing upward at an angle of about 45 degrees, the short butt end pointing downward toward the ground where the counterweight basket would eventually hang. The axle sat in its elm bearings, the ironwood journals dark against the lighter wood, and the whole assembly was balanced for the moment by the ropes that still held a portion of the weight. But before you could release those ropes and let the arm swing free, the axle needed to be secured laterally so that it could not slide out of its bearings, and this was where the iron straps came into their purpose. You had set up a small charcoal brazier near the frame, a simple iron dish on legs filled with glowing coals that you had lit earlier in the morning and fed with a pair of bellows until the heat was steady and even. Beside the brazier lay the 4 iron straps, each one a flat bar of wrought iron about 2 feet long and 2 inches wide, with holes punched at either end for the heavy nails that would secure them to the upright posts. The straps had been forged by the smith according to your specifications, their inner surfaces filed smooth and their outer surfaces left with the dark, scaly texture of the forge. You picked up the first strap with a pair of long-handled tongs and laid it across the coals, the iron immediately beginning to darken further with a thin layer of oxide, and you waited, watching the metal change color from black to a dull red, then to a brighter cherry, the heat radiating against your face in a gentle, steady wave. The iron was expanding as it heated, the metal's crystalline structure shifting to accommodate the added energy, and you knew from experience that it would grow by perhaps the thickness of a fingernail across its length, just enough to slip over the axle journal and then, upon cooling, contract to form a tight, unbreakable grip. When the strap was hot enough, you lifted it from the coals with the tongs, the iron glowing a soft orange in the grey light, and you carried it carefully to the nearest upright post. The strap was laid over the axle journal, where it rested in the bearing groove, the hot metal hissing slightly as it touched the greased wood, and you pressed it down with a wooden paddle, shaping it to the curve of the axle, the iron bending slightly under the pressure. The ends of the strap extended down over the sides of the upright post, and while the iron was still hot, you positioned it exactly over the pre-drilled nail holes. Then, taking a folded cloth that had been soaked in water, you pressed it against the strap, the cloth steaming and sizzling as the water flashed into vapor. The iron cooled rapidly, contracting with a faint, high-pitched ping, and the strap tightened around the axle journal like a fist closing. The grip was immediate and absolute, the axle now locked into its bearing, unable to shift or slide, and the contraction had drawn the strap so tight against the wood that you could not slip a piece of paper between the metal and the ironwood. You repeated this process for the second strap on the same side, securing the other side of the axle journal, and then you moved to the opposite upright post and did the same 2 straps there. Each strap was heated, placed, shaped, and cooled in its own time, and the work was unhurried, the coals glowing steadily, the steam rising in small puffs that vanished into the still air. The iron cooled from orange to black in a few moments, its surface taking on a bluish tint where the temper had been drawn, and when all 4 straps were in place, you drove the heavy iron nails through the holes and into the uprights, each blow of the hammer a dull, ringing note that echoed across the field and faded into the distance. The nails were clenched over on the far side, their points bent down into the wood to prevent them from working loose, and when the last nail was clenched, the axle was fixed, immovable, a permanent part of the structure. Now it was time to release the lifting ropes and let the arm hang free on its axle. You signaled to the laborers, and they eased the tension on the windlass, the ropes going slack inch by inch. The throwing arm settled onto its bearing surfaces, the ironwood journals pressing down into the greased elm grooves, and the ropes fell away entirely, leaving the arm suspended by nothing but its own geometry. It hung there, the long tip pointing skyward, the short butt end hanging down, and the balance was not yet what it would become once the counterweight was attached, but for now it was a thing of perfect stillness, a beam of ash floating on a cylinder of ironwood, held by leather and grease and iron straps, waiting for a force to set it in motion. You poured linseed oil over the bearing surfaces, the oil thick and golden, and you watched it seep into the elm and the leather, darkening the wood, filling the tiny pores and channels. The oil dripped slowly down the upright posts, leaving glossy trails that caught the light, and the smell of the oil was clean and nutty, a scent that mingled with the charcoal and the tallow and the lingering sweetness of the ash shavings that still lay in piles on the grass. You poured the oil generously, letting it soak in, and then you wiped away the excess with a clean rag. The bearing surfaces now slick and dark and ready. The moment had come to test the motion, and you reached up with one hand, placing your palm against the side of the throwing arm near its midsection. The wood was smooth and warm from the afternoon air, and you pushed gently, applying just the pressure of your arm's weight. The arm moved, the ironwood journals rotating in their bearings with a silence so complete that it was almost startling. The motion effortless, the counterweight end swinging downward as the long tip rose, the whole assembly pivoting on its axis like a balance scale weighing nothing at all. You pushed the arm down and then pulled it up, seesawing it with a single finger, and the motion was smooth and frictionless, the leather bearing doing its work, the oil and grease creating a film so thin and so perfect that the massive beam, which would require a team of men to lift if it were on the ground, could be moved by a child's hand. You let the arm come to rest, and it stopped in whatever position you left it, the balance so neutral that there was no tendency for it to swing one way or the other. The counterweight was not yet attached, of course, and once the basket was filled with stones, the short end would be far heavier, pulling the long end up into the air and holding it there until the trigger was released. But for now, the arm was a thing of equilibrium, a silent, balanced mechanism that waited patiently for its next component. You stood beneath it, looking up at the long ash beam silhouetted against the pale grey sky, and you felt the same quiet satisfaction that you had felt at the completion of the base frame, a sense that another piece of the puzzle had been fitted into its place, another step taken on the long, slow journey toward completion. The afternoon was waning, the light once again taking on that golden cast that seemed to be a feature of this particular field, and you gathered the iron tongs and the cooling bucket and the rags and the oil can, carrying them back to the supply stack one by one. The charcoal brazier you left to burn itself out, the coals fading from orange to grey, their heat dissipating into the cooling air. You wiped down the axle and the bearings with a final light application of oil, and you checked the iron straps, tugging on each one to confirm that it was tight, that the contraction had done its work, that nothing was loose or shifting. Everything held firm, and you nodded to yourself, a small, private acknowledgement, and then you walked to the western end of the frame and sat down on the sill, your back against the header beam, your eyes on the structure you had built. The trebuchet now had all its major components in place: the base frame, the upright posts, the throwing arm, the axle. The counterweight basket and the sling were still to come, and there were braces and windlass and trigger yet to be fitted. But the skeleton was complete, the bones of the machine articulated and ready. You sat in the quiet of the field, the grass around you bending in the light breeze, the distant city walls unchanged, and you let your mind drift across the details of the next day's work. The weaving of the sling would be a different kind of labor, a seated, repetitive task that would occupy your hands and leave your mind free to wander, and the filling of the counterweight basket with stones would be a slow accumulation of weight, a gradual tipping of the balance. These things lay ahead in a calm sequence, and you were in no hurry to reach them. When the light had faded enough that the lines of the frame began to blur into the surrounding dusk, you rose and walked back to the tent, your boots finding the familiar path by habit rather than sight. You lit the candle and wrote in the notebook, recording the dimensions of the axle, the leather-bearing lining, the heating and fitting of the iron straps, the oiling of the bearings, and the successful test of the pivot. The words were few, the sketch of the axle assembly was simple, and the act of writing was as calming as the work itself, a way to settle the events of the day into a coherent form before releasing them to sleep. You closed the notebook and lay back on the bedroll, the sounds of the night rising around you, and you thought of the throwing arm hanging in the darkness, balanced and still, waiting for the weight that would give it purpose. The thought was not urgent, only a quiet anticipation, and it faded as your breathing slowed and your muscles relaxed, the day's labor dissolving into a deep and peaceful rest that carried you gently into the night. The morning of the seventh day came with a softness that seemed to wrap itself around the field like a blanket, the sky a pale lavender gray that would later fade to the familiar silver, and you woke with the knowledge that today's work would be of an entirely different character from the days before. There would be no lifting of heavy timbers, no pounding of mallets, no heating of iron straps over glowing coals. Today you would sit in one place and weave, your hands moving in repetitive patterns while your mind drifted across the quiet landscape of the project, and the result of this patient labor would be the sling, the long cord of hemp and leather that would cup the projectile and release it at the apex of the throw. You ate your breakfast slowly, a heel of bread, and a small wedge of hard cheese that you sliced with the knife from your belt. And then you gathered the materials you would need and carried them to a spot near the trebuchet frame, where the grass was short and the ground was flat, a place where you could sit comfortably for many hours. The materials for the sling were few and simple. A long coil of hemp rope, fine-stranded and tightly twisted, its fibers a warm golden brown and its surface slightly waxy from the natural oils that remained in the strands. A large piece of thick leather, the same cowhide you had used for the axle bearing, now dry and stiff and waiting to be cut into the pouch that would hold the projectile. A smaller coil of thinner cord for the bindings and the knots, and an iron ring forged by the smith to its surface, its sponsored. You laid these materials out on the grass in front of you, arranging them in the order you would need them, and then you sat down cross-legged on a folded piece of sacking, your back resting against one of the base frame's crossbeams, and you began. The first task was to prepare the cords that would form the two long arms of the sling, the lines that would run from the iron ring down to the leather pouch and back up to the fixed attachment point on the throwing arm. The sling for a trebuchet of this size needed to be precisely calculated in length, because the arc of the throw and the timing of the release depended entirely on the geometry of these lines. You had worked out the measurements the evening before, sitting by candlelight with your notebook and a piece of charcoal, and you had arrived at a length of 22 feet for the longer arm, the one that would run from the ring to the pouch and then back up to a fixed pin on the arm, and 18 feet for the shorter arm, the one that would simply loop over the release pin and slip free. These numbers were not arbitrary. They were the product of careful calculation based on the length of the throwing arm, the height of the axle, and the weight of the countermass, and you wrote them down on a scrap of paper that you tucked under a stone beside your knee so you could refer to it as needed. You measured out the first length of rope, stretching it across the grass from one stake to another that you had driven into the ground at the correct distance, and you cut it with your knife, the blade slicing cleanly through the fibers with a soft crunch. The cut end you bound immediately with a whipping of thin cord, wrapping the cord around and around in tight, even turns, pulling each turn firm before adding the next, and when the whipping was complete, you tied it off with a knot that disappeared under the final wrap. The whipping would prevent the rope from unlaying itself, the strands separating and fraying under the immense forces they would endure, and you ran your thumb over the finished binding, feeling the smooth, hard surface, the texture of the cord like a tiny basket woven around the rope's end. You repeated this process for the second long cord and then for two shorter cords that would serve as the attachment lines between the pouch and the main arms. And when all the ropes were cut and whipped, you laid them out on the grass in parallel lines, their golden brown lengths, straight and true, ready to be joined. The leather pouch came next, and this required the use of a sharp curved knife and a wooden template you had carved from a piece of scrap ash. The template was a simple elongated oval, about 2 feet long and a foot wide at its center, and you laid it on the leather and traced around it with a pointed awl, the metal scratching a fine pale line into the dark surface. The leather was stiff and resisted the knife at first, but you worked slowly, making multiple passes, each cut deepening the groove a little more, until the shape came free with a soft tearing sound and fell onto the grass. The edges of the pouch were rough where the knife had cut, and you smoothed them with a fine rasp, the tool making a soft shushing sound, and then you folded the leather along its long axis to form a trough, the shape that would cup the projectile and hold it during the initial moments of the throw. The fold created a natural curve, the leather remembering the shape of the animal it had once been, and you held it in place with your knees while you marked the positions for the attachment holes. The holes you made with a sharp punch and a mallet, placing the punch against the leather at the marked points and striking it with a single, firm blow. The punch cut through cleanly, leaving a round hole about the diameter of your little finger, and you made 4 holes along each long edge of the pouch, spacing them evenly so that the load would be distributed without any single point bearing too much force. The sound of the punch was a sharp, crisp thump that echoed briefly across the field and then faded, and the smell of the cut leather, a rich animal scent, rose around you and blended with the grass and the earth, and the faint, distant sweetness of the forest. Now came the weaving itself, the long, repetitive process of braiding the cords together to form the net that would support the pouch and connect it to the main arms. You took up the first long cord and folded it in half, forming a loop at its midpoint, and you passed the looped end through one of the holes in the leather pouch, drawing it through until the loop emerged on the other side. Then you passed the 2 free ends of the cord through the loop and pulled them tight, the knot seating itself against the leather with a soft, firm pressure that compressed the fibers without cutting them. This was the first attachment, and you tested it by pulling on the cord, the leather holding fast, the knot secure. You attached the second cord to the adjacent hole in the same manner, and then the third and the fourth, working your way along the edge of the pouch with the same motion repeated each time, pass the loop through the hole, thread the ends through the loop, pull tight, test. The rhythm was steady and calming, a slow dance of fingers and cord and leather, and the pouch gradually became connected to its lines, the cords radiating outward like the strands of a spider's web. The net that would actually hold the projectile was woven from the thinner cord, and you began this by stretching a series of parallel strands across the inner surface of the pouch, anchoring them to the attachment cords with small, precise knots that you tied with the care of long practice. The net was a simple diamond pattern, each intersection of cord knotted to the ones beside it, and you worked from one end of the pouch to the other, your fingers moving in a rhythm that was almost automatic. Over, under, around, through, pull tight, next knot. Over, under, around, through, pull tight, next knot. Over, under, around, through, pull tight, next knot. The words formed a quiet chant in the back of your mind, a mantra that kept the pattern consistent, without requiring conscious thought, and the net grew steadily, the diamond shapes expanding and multiplying until they covered the entire inner surface of the leather. The completed net would keep the projectile from shifting during the initial acceleration, holding it firmly against the pouch until the moment of release when the sling opened and the stone flew free. The iron ring was the final piece of the sling assembly, and you attached it to the end of the longer arm with a complex knot that you had learned many years ago from an old sapper, whose name you could no longer recall. The knot involved passing the rope through the ring, then around itself, then back through the ring, then through the resulting loop, a series of turns and passes that looked like a tangled puzzle, but produced, when drawn tight, a connection that would never slip and never loosen. You pulled each turn firm before making the next, the rope creaking softly as it tightened, and when the knot was complete, you trimmed the excess cord and whipped the end just as you had done with the cut ropes. The ring hung from its cord, a dark circle of iron that would slip over the release pin at the tip of the throwing arm, and when you lifted it, it swung gently back and forth with a faint, pleasant weight. The completed sling lay on the grass before you, its 2 long arms stretching out from the central pouch like the limbs of some strange, elongated creature, the iron ring at the end of the longer arm glinting dully in the grey light. You lifted it carefully, gathering the coils of rope, and you carried it to the throwing arm where it hung suspended on its axle. The arm had been fitted with 2 iron pins during your earlier work, one at the very tip where the sling ring would be placed, and one partway down the upper surface where the fixed end of the sling would be permanently attached. You reached up and looped the shorter arm over the fixed pin, pulling it tight, and then you let the long arm hang down, the iron ring swinging freely just below the tip of the throwing arm. The sling was now in place, a long, graceful curve of rope and leather that would, in time, become the means by which the trebuchet fulfilled its purpose, though that purpose still lay far in the future. With the sling hanging from the arm, you now had the counterweight net to weave, a separate but related task that would occupy the remainder of the afternoon. The counterweight basket was a large open mesh bag that would hang from the short end of the throwing arm, and it needed to be strong enough to hold many hundreds of pounds of stones while withstanding the sudden acceleration of the throw. The material for this net was a heavier rope, thick as your thumb and rough to the touch, its fibers twisted into a sturdy 3-strand lay that would resist abrasion and weathering. You had a large wooden needle for this work, a smooth, flat tool about a foot long, with a hole at one end through which the rope could be threaded, and you sat down again on your sacking, the needle in your hand, the coil of rope beside you on the grass. The net was woven in the same diamond pattern as the sling net, but on a much larger scale, the openings between knots about the width of your hand rather than the width of your finger. You began by tying a series of loops along a wooden batten, a straight piece of ash about 3 feet long, that would serve as the top edge of the basket, and from these loops you worked downward, weaving the rope through the loops with the needle, pulling each knot tight, advancing to the next loop, and repeating. The needle moved through the air in a steady, flowing motion, dipping and rising, the rope trailing behind it like a thick brown snake, and the net grew row by row, the open diamonds forming a mesh that would hold the stones while allowing water to drain and air to circulate. The work was even more repetitive than the sling weaving, the pattern unchanging from row to row, and your mind wandered freely as your hands continued their automatic labor. You thought about the stones that would fill this basket, the smooth, water-worn cobbles that you would gather from the stream bed that ran along the northern edge of the field. You had walked that stream many times in the evenings, noting the variety of stones that lay in its shallows, and you knew exactly where to find the ones you needed. Round, dense stones of granite and basalt, each one about the size of a small melon, their surfaces polished by centuries of flowing water. The stream was a peaceful place, its water a constant, gentle murmur, and the thought of spending a day there, lifting stones from the cool current and carrying them to the basket, was a pleasant one. It would be a day of simple physical work, the kind of work that tired the body without taxing the mind, and you looked forward to it with the same quiet anticipation that you felt for every stage of this project. The afternoon light shifted slowly around you, the grey sky brightening a little toward the west, where the sun was trying to break through, and the shadow of the trebuchet frame crept across the grass like a sundial marking the hours. You worked on, row after row, the net growing longer and longer, and when you had woven about 4 feet of mesh, you began to shape the basket by reducing the number of loops in each row, drawing the net inward so that it would form a closed bottom when you were finished. The reduction required careful counting, dropping 1 loop every few knots, and you kept track with a series of pebbles placed in a line on the grass, moving 1 pebble from the left pile to the right pile each time you made a reduction. The pebbles were small and smooth, and the act of moving them was another small ritual, a marker of progress in a task that was measured in inches rather than feet. By the time the light began its slow fade toward evening, the counterweight net was nearly complete. It hung from the batten like a great open weave of rope, its shape tapering from the wide top to the narrower bottom, and you held it up to inspect it, turning it in your hands, checking each knot for tightness and consistency. A few knots needed to be pulled tighter, and you worked them with your fingers, drawing the rope through until the mesh was even, and then you tied off the bottom with a final heavy knot that cinched the net closed. The basket was ready, and you carried it to the trebuchet and hung it from the iron hooks that you had bolted to the short end of the throwing arm, the hooks fitting through the loops of the top batten, and the basket swung gently there, an empty vessel waiting to be filled. You gathered up the scraps of rope and leather, the offcuts and the trimmings, and you bundled them together with a length of cord to be stored for future repairs. The tools you wiped clean and returned to their places, the needle and the awl and the punch and the curved knife, and then you sat down on the base frame and looked at the trebuchet in its nearly complete state. The long throwing arm pointed up at the grey sky, the sling hanging from its tip, the counterweight basket hanging from its butt, and the whole assembly was a study in balance and tension, a machine that was almost alive in its complexity and its potential. You felt the same quiet satisfaction that had accompanied each completed stage, a sense that the work was good and true, and you let that feeling settle into you as you watched the evening gather. The walk back to the tent was slow, your legs stiff from sitting, and you stopped by the stream to wash your hands in the cold water, the mud and the rope fibers swirling away into the current. The water was clear and clean, and you cupped some in your hands and drank, the coldness shocking your throat and then fading to a pleasant coolness in your stomach. You sat by the stream for a while, watching the water flow over the stones, the same stones that would soon fill the counterweight basket, and you listened to the quiet music of the current, a sound that was both constant and ever-changing, the oldest lullaby in the world. In the tent, the candle flame flickered in its now familiar pattern, and you wrote in your notebook with the stub of charcoal that was growing smaller each day. The entry recorded the sling dimensions, the leather pouch pattern, the weaving of the counterweight net, and a note about the stones you would gather the next day from the stream. The sketch was of the sling in place on the arm, the lines of the ropes curving down to the pouch, the iron ring of the tip, and when you had finished, you closed the notebook and placed it under your pillow. The night sounds were the same as always, the rustle and the hoot and the soft breathing of the earth, and you lay in the darkness with the image of the woven ropes in your mind, the diamond patterns repeating and repeating, a visual mantra that led you gently down into a sleep that was as calm and as deep as the stream that had sung to you at dusk. The morning of the 8th day dawned with a quality of light that felt different somehow, a faint golden tint behind the grey that promised the sun might break through before the afternoon, and you woke with a specific purpose already formed in your mind. Today you would go to the stream, the same stream that had sung you to sleep with its quiet music the night before, and you would gather the stones that would fill the counterweight basket and give the trebuchet its power. The basket hung empty from the short end of the throwing arm, its woven mesh swaying gently in the breeze that came from the west, and the long arm pointed up at the sky at a steep angle, waiting for the weight that would pull it down and complete the balance of the machine. You ate your breakfast standing up, too eager in a quiet way to sit still, and then you gathered a collection of empty sacks and a small handcart that had been left by the supply wagons, its wooden wheels creaking softly as you pulled it across the grass toward the northern edge of the field. The stream lay about 300 paces from the trebuchet frame, a distance you had walked many times in the evenings, but never with the intention of taking anything from it. It was not a large stream, perhaps 10 feet across at its widest point, and no deeper than your knees in the deepest pools, but it ran clear and steady over a bed of stones that had been worn smooth by countless years of flowing water. The banks were lined with willow trees whose long trailing branches dipped into the current and created shifting patterns of shadow and light on the surface, and the sound of the water was a constant, gentle murmur that seemed to fill the air without ever being loud. You left the handcart on the bank and stood for a moment, looking down into the water, watching the way it flowed around the larger stones and created tiny eddies that swirled and dissipated, and swirled and dissipated, and swirled again. The stones you needed were not just any stones. They needed to be dense and heavy, of a uniform size that would pack efficiently into the basket, and they needed to be smooth enough that they would not abrade the rope netting as the basket swung and shifted during the throw. Granite was ideal, a dark grey stone flecked with tiny crystals of quartz that sparkled faintly when wet, and basalt was nearly as good, a denser, blacker stone that was heavier than it looked. The stream bed offered both in abundance, the stones sorted naturally by the current into bands of similar size, and you removed your boots and rolled up the legs of your trousers and stepped down into the water, the coldness shocking your skin for just a moment before fading to a pleasant numbness. You began near the bank, where the stones were smaller and easier to reach, and you lifted the first one from the water, turning it over in your hands. It was a piece of granite, roughly oval and about the size of a small melon, its surface smooth and cool and its weight satisfyingly substantial. The water ran off it in rivulets, and you wiped it dry with a corner of your tunic, inspecting it for any cracks or flaws that might cause it to split under load. Finding none, you placed it in the handcart, where it made a solid, definitive thud against the wooden bed. The first stone of many, and the sound of it landing in the cart was a small, satisfying punctuation to the start of the day's labor. You worked your way upstream, wading slowly through the cool water, bending to lift one stone after another. Each stone was slightly different from the last, a variation in shape or color or weight that kept the task from becoming entirely monotonous. Some were rounded and smooth, worn to perfect ovals by the water's patient abrasion. Others were flatter, more like discs, and these you rejected because they might stack poorly in the basket and leave gaps. A few were covered in a thin layer of green algae that made them slippery, and you rubbed these clean with a handful of wet sand, the grit scouring away the green and revealing the dark stone beneath. The process was simple and physical, a bending and lifting and carrying that used your body in a way that felt good and natural, and the slow accumulation of stones in the cart was a visible measure of progress that satisfied something deep in your mind. The water made its own quiet sounds around you, the gurgle and splash of the current, the plink of droplets falling from your hands, the soft sucking noise of your feet sinking into the sandy bottom. Overhead, the willows rustled in a light breeze, their leaves a pale green that filtered the grey sky into a dappled pattern on the water's surface, and a pair of ducks paddled past at a distance, their movements unhurried, their heads dipping occasionally beneath the surface. You paused to watch them, your hands resting on a large stone that was half buried in the stream bed, and the ducks watched you back with their small, dark eyes before drifting around a bend and disappearing behind a curtain of willow branches. After an hour or so, the handcart was perhaps a third full, and you pulled it further upstream to a spot where the stream widened into a shallow pool, the water here barely moving, the surface like a sheet of grey glass. The stones in the pool were larger, the size of small cabbages rather than melons, and you selected these with more care because the largest stones would go at the bottom of the basket and the smaller ones would fill the spaces between. You lifted a particularly fine piece of basalt, its surface so smooth it felt almost greasy, and you held it in both hands, feeling its weight, its density, the way it seemed to pull downward with more force than its size would suggest. This stone, you thought, would be at the very center of the basket, a core of heaviness around which the rest would be arranged, and you placed it in the cart with a sense of having found something valuable, though its value was only in its mass and its shape and its fitness for a purpose that was entirely practical. The morning passed in this way, a steady, rhythmic gathering that filled the cart slowly, and you moved further upstream to a section of the stream where the current ran faster over a bed of smaller cobbles that tattered faintly as the water pushed them along. Here the stones were already sorted by size, the current having deposited them in neat bands, and you could simply reach down and select the ones that matched your requirements without having to search. The work became even more repetitive, a simple sequence of bend, lift, inspect, place, bend again, and your mind began to wander in the way it had during the weaving of the nets. You thought about the trebuchet, about the way the weight of these stones would pull the short arm down and raise the long arm up, about the potential energy that would be stored in that raised mass, waiting for the trigger to release it. The thought was not urgent, just a gentle drifting of the mind across familiar territory, and it was accompanied by the constant, calming sound of the water, and the rustle of the willows, and the distant, barely audible calls of birds in the forest. By the time the sun finally broke through the overcast, a pale disk of white gold that turned the stream into a ribbon of reflected light, the handcart was full. The stones were piled in a neat heap, their wet surfaces gleaming, their colors ranging from the dark gray of granite to the near black of basalt, with a few pieces of pale quartzite mixed in where you had found them, their white surfaces contrasting with the darker stones. You pulled the cart out of the stream bed and onto the bank, the wheels sinking slightly into the soft earth, and you sat down on the grass to rest for a moment, your feet dangling in the water, the coldness a pleasant relief after the work of lifting and carrying. You drank from your flask and ate a few dried figs, the sweetness cutting through the taste of the stream water, and you watched the ducks return, their paddling feet making small V-shaped ripples that spread and faded on the surface of the pool. The cart was heavy now, the stones collectively weighing perhaps 300 pounds, and pulling it back to the trebuchet required a steady, patient effort, the wheels bumping over the uneven ground, the stones shifting and settling with a low grinding sound. You leaned into the pull, the cart's handles pressing against your palms, and you walked slowly, one step at a time, the grass brushing against the wheels. The distance was not great, but the weight made it feel longer, and you paused once or twice to rest, standing with your hands on your hips, looking at the trebuchet frame that grew larger with each stop. The throwing arm was visible above the grass, its long ash length pointing skyward, and the sight of it gave you a small measure of motivation that was entirely calm, a simple desire to see the next stage completed. At the trebuchet, you positioned the handcart directly beneath the counterweight basket, and you began the second part of the day's work, transferring the stones from the cart into the woven net. This was a different kind of task, a lifting and placing that required more care because the stones needed to be arranged in the basket so that they would not shift during the throw and unbalance the machine. You started with the largest stones, the ones you had gathered from the pool, and you placed them in the bottom of the basket, fitting them together like a puzzle, turning each one until it sat firmly against its neighbors with no gaps that might allow movement. The net stretched and creaked as the weight increased, the rope fibers adjusting to the load, and the basket settled lower, its bottom now a tight, solid mass of dark stone. The medium-sized stones came next, and you placed these in layers, filling the spaces between the larger ones, tapping each stone with the heel of your hand to seat it firmly. The sound of stone against stone was a dull, solid clunk, and the basket grew heavier with each addition, the throwing arm above you beginning to respond to the increasing weight. The short end of the arm, which had hung downward at a steep angle, was now pulling further down, and the long end, the one with the sling attached, was rising in response, the axle turning silently in its greased bearings. The motion was so gradual that you could not see it happening, but each time you looked up, the angle of the arm had changed by a small amount, the tip now higher against the sky than it had been before. The small stones, the ones the size of plums and apricots, were the last to go in, and you poured them from the sacks in a steady stream, the stones rattling into the basket and filling the remaining voids, the sound a continuous clatter that faded as the basket filled. You shook the basket gently between additions, the net swaying, the stones settling with a soft grinding noise, and when the last stone was in place, the basket was full, a compact mass of grey and black that was almost spherical, held in its net of rope, hanging heavily from the short end of the throwing arm. The long arm now pointed up at the sky, at a much shallower angle, perhaps 30 degrees from vertical, and the whole machine was transformed, no longer a balanced, neutral thing, but a structure under tension, the counterweight pulling down with a force that you could feel just by looking at it. You counted the stones, as you always counted things, with pebbles moved from one pile to another, and the total came to 147 stones. A number that had no particular significance, but that you recorded in your mind to write down later. The total weight you estimated was somewhere close to 900 pounds, enough to raise the long arm with its projectile and deliver a throw of considerable force. The exact weight did not matter so much as the proportion, the ratio of countermass to projectile that would determine the efficiency of the transfer of energy, and you had calculated that ratio many times in your notebook, the numbers scratched in charcoal, the diagram showing the arc of the throw and the parabola of the projectile's flight. With the basket filled, you now needed to secure the counterweight net to ensure that no stones would fall out during the sudden acceleration of the throw. You had prepared a heavy rope drawstring that ran through the loops at the top of the basket, and you pulled this tight now, cinching the neck of the net closed so that the stones were contained, the rope biting into the mesh. The knot you tied a complex permanent thing that would not loosen under any force. The excess rope you coiled neatly and tucked into a loop on the side of the basket, where it would be out of the way, and then you stepped back to look at the result. The counterweight was a dark, heavy sphere of stone and rope hanging from the short arm, a concentration of potential energy that was both impressive and, in a strange way, beautiful, a thing of pure function that had acquired a kind of dignity through its purpose. You spent the remainder of the afternoon making small adjustments to the trebuchet's balance. The counterweight, now fully loaded, had changed the dynamics of the machine, and you needed to check that everything was still aligned and secure. You walked around the frame, inspecting each joint and peg, testing the iron straps with a pull of your hand, checking the axle bearings for any sign of excessive wear. Everything held firm, the oak and the iron and the elm doing their work, the stresses distributed through the structure as you had intended. You added a little more oil to the bearings, the golden liquid seeping into the wood, and you adjusted the position of the sling on the throwing arm, making sure the iron ring was seated properly on the release pin. The machine was now almost complete, lacking only the windlass and the trigger mechanism, and it stood in the field like a great resting animal, its head raised, its weight settled, waiting for the moment when it would be called upon to move. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon. the golden light of the afternoon deepening to a warm amber that made the oak of the frame glow and the stones of the counterweight gleam with a faint, wet sheen. You sat on the western sill of the base frame, your back against an upright post, and you looked at the trebuchet, at the long throwing arm silhouetted against the pale sky, at the counterweight hanging heavily at its end, at the sling dangling from the tip like a long, braided tail. The sight was a satisfying one, the culmination of many days of patient work, and you allowed yourself a moment of quiet contemplation, a pause in the long, slow rhythm of the project to appreciate how far it had come from the empty field and the rectangle of string that had marked its beginning. The walk back to the tent was slower than usual, your muscles tired from the lifting and carrying, and you stopped at the stream again to wash the dust and the grit from your hands and face. The water was still cool, still clear, still murmuring its endless song, and you sat on the bank for a while, letting your feet dangle in the current, watching the light fade from the sky. The ducks had gone, and the willows were dark shapes against the twilight, and the stream itself was a ribbon of silver grey that flowed away into the gathering dusk. You felt a deep, quiet tiredness, the kind that comes from a day of physical work done well, and it was a pleasant feeling, a heaviness in your limbs that promised a good night's sleep. In the tent, the candle was a small, steady flame, and you wrote in your notebook with the stub of charcoal that was now so small you could barely hold it. The entry recorded the number of stones, the estimated weight, the condition of the bearings after the counterweight was added, and a small note about the cinching of the basket net. The sketch was of the trebuchet in its current state, the arm at its new angle, the counterweight hanging below, and when you had finished, you closed the notebook and set it aside. The sounds of the night were the familiar sounds, the rustle and the hoot and the soft breathing of the earth, and you lay in the darkness with the image of the filled basket in your mind, the stones packed tight, the net drawn closed, the weight of it pulling downward through the frame and into the ground. The image was solid and calming, a weight that anchored your thoughts and held them still, and you let it carry you down into a sleep that was as deep and as heavy as the stones themselves, a rest earned by the slow, patient labor of a day well spent. The 9th morning came with a sky that was neither grey nor blue, but a soft, washed-out colour somewhere between the two, and you woke with the knowledge that today the trebuchet would move under load for the first time, not a full throw, not yet, but a test of the mechanism, a slow pulling down of the long arm against the weight of the countermass, a careful engagement of the trigger, and then a release into empty air so that you could observe how the machine behaved and make whatever adjustments were needed before the first real stone was cast. You ate your bread without tasting it, your mind already out in the field, and you laced your boots with the same steady, unhurried motions you applied to every task, the leather of the laces smooth and familiar between your fingers. The windlass that would pull the arm down had been assembled the previous afternoon from components that had arrived on a cart several days before. It stood now at the rear of the trebuchet frame, a horizontal drum of oak mounted between two stout A-frame supports that were themselves bolted to the base sills with heavy iron brackets. The drum was a cylinder about 8 inches in diameter and 4 feet long, its surface scored with shallow grooves that would guide the winding rope and prevent it from slipping, and at each end of the drum were the iron handles, long cranks that 2 men could turn while walking in a slow circle. The rope itself was the thickest you had used in the entire project, a 3-inch hawser of twisted flax that was almost too thick to hold in one hand, and it ran from the windlass drum through a series of pulley blocks that directed its path toward the tip of the throwing arm, where an iron eye had been bolted through the wood to receive it. You inspected the entire rig now, walking slowly from the windlass to the first pulley block, which was anchored to a heavy stake driven deep into the earth, then to the second block mounted on the base frame, then to the third block at the foot of the upright post, and finally up to the arm itself, the rope tracing a zigzag path through the air that was clean and direct, with no sharp angles or points of chafing. The labourers arrived as you were finishing your inspection, the same 2 quiet brothers who had been with the project since the laying of the base frame, and they took their places at the windlass handles without needing to be told. You had explained the procedure the day before, speaking in the same calm, matter-of-fact tone you used for everything, and they had listened with the same patient attention, asking no questions because there were no questions to ask. Now you gave a single nod, and they began to turn the handles, walking slowly around the windlass, their boots pressing the grass in a circle that had already been worn into a visible path from the earlier lifts. The ratchet clicked as the drum turned, a wooden pawl engaging the iron teeth of the wheel with a sound that was both sharp and soft, a metallic wooden note that punctuated the quiet of the field. The rope tightened gradually, the slack being taken up inch by inch, and you watched the line as it straightened, the fibers stretching in the lining under the load. The pulley blocks creaked as they took the strain, their iron sheaves turning in their wooden shells with a faint, high-pitched hum, and the rope itself made a sound like a long, slow exhale as the twist of the fibers tightened. The throwing arm, which had been pointing up at its steep angle, began to move, the long tip descending toward the ground as the windlass pulled it down, the ironwood axle rotating silently in its greased bearings. The movement was so slow that you could not see it happening. You could only notice, each time you looked, that the angle of the arm had changed, the tip now lower against the pale sky, the counterweight end now higher, the whole machine shifting its geometry in response to the steady pull of the rope. The laborers walked their circle, and the ratchet clicked, and the rope wound onto the drum in neat, tight coils that overlapped each other with a precision that was satisfying to watch. The windlass had been designed with a groove pitch that matched the thickness of the rope exactly, so that each turn of the drum laid the rope alongside the previous turn without gaps or overlaps, and as the coils accumulated, the effective diameter of the drum increased slightly, which meant that each subsequent turn pulled a little more rope than the one before. You had calculated this into the design, the gradual acceleration of the winding, and it was gratifying to see the mathematics translate into the physical reality of moving timber and rope. The throwing arm descended through its arc with a slowness that was almost geological, the tip that had been 40 feet in the air now dropping to 30 feet, then to 20, and the counterweight basket at the other end rising in response, the stones inside it grinding softly against each other as the angle of the basket changed. The sling, which had been hanging loosely from the tip, began to slide along the ground as the arm came down, the leather pouch dragging over the grass with a soft rustling sound, and you walked over to it and lifted it clear, draping the cords over your shoulder to keep them from tangling. The iron ring at the end of the sling dangled near your elbow, and you could feel the weight of it, the cold metal pressing through the fabric of your tunic. When the arm had been drawn down to a point where the tip was about 10 feet above the ground, you called for a halt, and the laborers stopped walking, their hands resting on the windlass handles, their breathing slightly deeper than before but still calm and even. The ratchet held the load, its pawl locked into a tooth, and the rope hummed with tension, a low, almost inaudible vibration that you could feel if you placed your hand on it. The trebuchet was now in its cocked position, the counterweight raised high at the short end, the long arm pulled down and ready, and the whole machine was a study in stored energy, a spring compressed and waiting. The trigger mechanism was the next component to be tested, and you walked to the rear of the frame where it was mounted. The trigger was a simple but precise device, consisting of a heavy iron hook that engaged with an iron ring bolted to the underside of the throwing arm near its tip, and a long wooden lever that extended back from the hook to a point where a single person could operate it. When the lever was pulled, the hook would rotate on its pivot pin and release the ring, allowing the counterweight to drop and the arm to fly upward. The mechanism had been forged by the smith to your exact specifications, and you had fitted it to the frame the previous evening, bolting the pivot bracket to the base sill and aligning the hook with the ring on the arm. Now, with the arm in its cocked position, the hook was engaged, the ring seated in the curve of the iron, and the lever lay flat along the frame, held in place by a simple wooden pin that prevented accidental release. You checked the alignment of the hook and ring, kneeling beside the frame and peering at the engagement from several angles. The fit was clean, the iron surfaces meeting with no visible gap, and the hook's curve wrapped around the ring in a way that would hold securely until the lever was pulled. You removed the safety pin, a wooden dowel that slid out of its hole with a soft, smooth motion, and you set it aside on the grass. Then you took hold of the trigger lever, a smooth ash pole about 6 feet long that extended well beyond the rear of the frame, and you prepared to pull it. This was the moment of the first release, and though there was no projectile in the sling and no target to aim at, there was still a certain gravity to it, a sense that the machine was about to demonstrate its essential nature for the first time. You stood to one side of the lever, positioning yourself so that you would be clear of any moving parts, and you pulled downward with a steady, even pressure. The lever moved smoothly on its pivot, the hook rotated, and the ring slit free with a soft, metallic clink that was almost musical. The release was clean, no catching or hesitation, and then the trebuchet did what it was designed to do. The counterweight dropped, pulled by the Earth's steady gravity, and the short end of the arm descended in a sweeping arc that was surprisingly quiet given the forces involved. The long arm rose in response, its tip swinging upward through the air with a sound that was less a whoosh and more a deep, resonant hum, the ash beam flexing slightly along its length, the ironwood axle spinning in its bearings with a smoothness that was almost silent. The sling, which you had laid out on the grass in front of the machine, was snapped forward by the accelerating tip, the cords whipping through the air, the leather pouch sliding over the grass and then lifting off, empty, and the whole assembly came to rest with the long arm pointing up at the sky at its original steep angle, the counterweight hanging down, the machine now in its resting state once more. The energy of the drop dissipated into the air, and the frame and the gentle swaying of the basket. You let out a breath you had not been aware of holding, and you walked around the machine, checking every joint and strap and bearing. The iron straps on the axle were tight, the pegs in the base frame were solid, the windlass rope had not slipped, and the trigger mechanism had reset itself automatically as the arm rose, the hook falling back into position under its own weight, ready to engage again. The test had been successful in every particular, and he felt the quiet satisfaction of seeing a design validated, the theory translated into practice without drama or failure. The trebuchet worked, and it worked smoothly, and that was all that needed to be said about it. The laborers had watched the release from a safe distance, their expressions unchanged, and now they returned to the windlass to begin the second test. You wanted to run the machine through its cycle several times, observing each repetition for any variations or inconsistencies, and you also wanted to adjust the length of the sling cords to fine-tune the release angle. The first test had shown that the sling was releasing a little early, the pouch lifting off the ground before the arm had reached its full vertical position, and you knew that this could be corrected by shortening the longer arm of the sling by a few inches. You measured the cords with your marked rope, comparing the lengths to the calculations in your notebook, and you made a small adjustment, untying the knot at the iron ring and retying it a hand's breadth shorter. The knot was the same complex, permanent knot you had used when you first assembled the sling, and tying it again was a familiar, comforting exercise in rope work. The second test was identical to the first in its procedure, the laborers walking their slow circle, the ratchet clicking, the rope tightening, the arm descending, the hook engaging, the trigger pulling, the counterweight dropping, the arm rising, the sling snapping forward. This time the sling released a little later, the pouch staying on the ground for a fraction of a second longer, and the arc of the imaginary projectile would have been correspondingly higher. You adjusted the sling again, shortening the cord by another finger's width, and you ran a third test, and then a fourth, each one a repetition of the same quiet sequence, the machine cycling through its motion with a reliability that was both reassuring and, in its way, beautiful. Between tests, you checked the bearings and added a little more oil, the golden liquid spreading over the ironwood journals, and you inspected the rope for any signs of fraying, running your hand along its length, feeling for broken fibers or soft spots. The rope was holding up well, its surface slightly polished by the friction of the pulleys, and you decided it would serve for many more cycles before needing replacement. You also checked the counterweight net, making sure the stones had not shifted during the drops, and you found them still packed tight, the drawstring still cinched, the net still whole and strong. The afternoon was now well advanced, the sun having moved across the sky from its morning position to a point where it cast the trebuchet's shadow far to the east, a long, distorted silhouette of frame and arm and basket that stretched across the grass like a dark reflection. You sat down on the base frame and looked at the machine, which was now not just a structure of wood and rope and iron, but a functioning mechanism, a thing that could move and do work and fulfill the purpose for which it had been designed. There was still the matter of the first real throw, the placing of a stone in the sling pouch and the release that would send it flying toward the distant walls. But that was for another day, a day when the conditions were right and the final adjustments had been made. You thought about those final adjustments while you sat there, the windlass rope making small creaking sounds as it settled, the sling cords swaying gently in the breeze. The angle of the release pin on the tip of the arm could be modified slightly by filing the iron, changing the moment when the sling ring would slip free, and the length of the sling itself could be further fine-tuned, and the counterweight might need a few more stones or a few less to achieve the perfect balance of power and control. These were small things, details of refinement that could occupy a day or two of patient work, and you looked forward to them with the same quiet anticipation that you had felt at every stage of the project. The laborers had finished coiling the extra rope and were now sitting at the edge of the forest, eating their evening meal in their usual silence, and you walked over to join them for a moment, exchanging a few words about the tests and the adjustments. They nodded at your comments, their faces showing the same calm, unreadable expressions they had worn since the first day, and you felt a sense of camaraderie that needed no words, a shared understanding of the work and its rhythms. You thanked them for their help, and they nodded again, and then you walked back to the tent as the light began its slow fade into evening. In the tent, the candle was a steady flame, and you wrote in your notebook with a fresh stub of charcoal, the old one having finally worn down to nothing. The entry was longer than usual, recording the details of the 4 test cycles, the sling adjustments, the trigger performance, and the condition of the bearings and ropes. You sketched a diagram of the release mechanism, showing the hook and ring in their engaged and released positions, and you added a note about the angle of the release pin and the possible need for filing. The sketch was precise and careful, the lines of charcoal capturing the geometry of the iron parts, and when you had finished, you closed the notebook and set it aside with a sense of completeness, a feeling that the day had been well spent and that the trebuchet was one step closer to its final purpose. The night sounds were the same as always, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft breathing of the earth, and you lay in the darkness with the image of the machine in your mind, the long arm swinging through its arc, the counterweight dropping, the sling snapping forward. The image repeated itself, a gentle loop of motion that was both calming and satisfying, and you let it play over and over, each repetition softer and slower than the last, until the motion blurred into stillness, and the stillness became sleep, deep and quiet and without dreams. The 10th day began without any discernible change in the weather. The sky, a continuation of the same soft, washed-out hue that had hung over the field for more than a week, and you woke with a feeling of quiet completeness that had been growing in you since the successful tests of the day before. The trebuchet stood in its place outside, a dark silhouette against the pale grey, and you knew that today would not be a day of heavy labor or major construction. Today was for the small things, the final adjustments, and the careful checks that would turn a functioning machine into a reliable one. And after those were done, there would be nothing left but to wait, to let the machine sit in its completed state while the hours passed slowly around it. You ate your bread and dried fruit with the same unhurried pace you had maintained since the first morning, and then you walked out into the field where the grass was now crisscrossed with the paths of your daily movements, a map of the project's history pressed into the earth. The trebuchet looked as it had the evening before, the long throwing arm pointing up at its steep angle, the counterweight basket hanging heavily at the short end, the sling draped over the tip and trailing down to the grass like a long braided tail. You circled the machine slowly, your eyes moving over every joint and beam, and you began the methodical sequence of final calibrations that you had planned the night before. The first of these involved the release pin, that small but critical piece of iron at the very tip of the throwing arm over which the sling ring slipped at the moment of release. You had observed during the tests that the ring was catching slightly on a microscopic burr left by the smith's file, a roughness too small to see, but detectable in the faint hesitation before the sling snapped free, and you wanted to eliminate that imperfection so that the release would be as smooth as oiled glass. You took a fine-cut file from your tool roll, a slender instrument with a handle of polished horn, and you climbed the short ladder you had propped against the upright post until you could reach the tip of the arm, the ash beam warm and solid under your hand. The file made a soft, musical zinging sound as you drew it across the iron, each stroke removing a layer of metal too thin to measure, and you paused frequently to wipe the surface with a rag and feel it with your fingertip, testing for the smoothness you required. When the pin felt like silk under your touch, you stopped filing and applied a thin coat of tallow to protect it from rust, the grease darkening the silver metal to a dull grey. The next adjustment was to the sling itself, the length of which you had been fine-tuning throughout the tests, and now you made one final alteration based on your observations of the release angle. You untied the complex knot at the iron ring, the same knot you had tied and untied several times before, and you shortened the longer arm by a measured 3-finger widths, using the marks you had scratched into a reference stick as a guide. The rope was stiff from being under tension, and you worked it with your hands, flexing the fibers until they relaxed, and then you retied the knot with the slow, deliberate passes that had become second nature. When the sling was reattached, you stood back and sighted along its length, tracing the curve of the cords from the tip of the arm down to the leather pouch and back up to the fixed attachment point, and the geometry looked correct to your eye. The proportions balanced in a way that pleased some deep, instinctive part of your mind. The windlass rope needed attention as well, for the repeated cycles of winding and release had stretched the fibers slightly, and there was now a small amount of slack in the system that had not been there before. You loosened the clamp that held the rope end to the windlass drum, pulled the rope taut by hand, and reclamped it with the excess length trimmed away. The cut end whipped with thin cord, just as you had whipped all the other cut ends. The rope now lay snug against the drum, its coils tight and even, and you turned the windlass handles by hand to confirm that the tension was uniform throughout the length. The ratchet clicked softly as the drum moved, a familiar sound that had become as much a part of the field's ambient noise as the rustle of the grass. You moved next to the axle bearings, those blocks of elm that held the ironwood journals in their greased grooves, and you inspected them closely for any sign of wear or overheating. The surfaces were smooth and cool to the touch, the oil having done its work, and you added a little more linseed oil from the clay bottle you kept in your satchel, the golden liquid pooling in the groove before seeping slowly into the wood. The oil made the elm darken to a deep, rich brown, and the smell of it, clean and nutty, rose around you in a small cloud that dissipated quickly in the still air. You turned your attention to the iron straps, tugging on each one with your fingers, and they were as tight as the day you had fitted them, the contraction of the cooling metal having formed a bond that would not loosen over time. After the mechanical adjustments were complete, you took up a broom made of birch twigs that you had kept leaning against the base frame, and you began to sweep the platform. The deck planks that you had laid across the base frame weeks ago had accumulated a fine layer of dust, wood shavings, and bits of dried grass carried by the wind, and you swept them clean with long, steady strokes that pushed the debris over the edge and onto the ground. The twigs made a soft, whispering sound against the wood, and the rhythmic motion of the sweeping was calming in the way that all repetitive physical tasks are calming. A simple, pervasive action that required no thought and left a visible result. When the platform was clean, you swept the area around the base frame as well, clearing away the scattered stone shims and wood chips that had accumulated during the construction, and the ground around the trebuchet now looked tidy and ordered, a neat workspace surrounding the machine it had produced. The final task was to check the counterweight net, and you climbed the short ladder again to inspect the basket where it hung at the short end of the arm. The stones were still packed tightly, the drawstring still secure, the netting still free of any frayed or broken strands, and you gave the basket a gentle push to see if the stones shifted. They did not, the mass moving as a single solid unit, and you nodded to yourself and climbed down, satisfied that the counterweight was as stable as it had been when you first filled it. The basket swayed slightly after your push, a slow pendulum motion that dampened gradually until it hung still once more, and you watched it for a moment, the heavy sphere of stone and rope suspended in the air, a concentration of potential that was also a thing of quiet, immobile beauty. Now there was nothing left to do. The trebuchet was complete, every beam and joint and strap and knot in its proper place, every adjustment made, every surface oiled and clean. You stood in front of it, your